the German soldier thought he was marching toward Moscow, but before the year ended, he would be digging his own truck out of frozen mud while Soviet guns opened in the snow. What began as Hitler's confident invasion soon turned into empty fuel cans, broken roads, burned villages, and a front so vast that every advance made Germany weaker. This is not just the story of tanks racing east, but of an empire discovering too late that distance, winter, Soviet endurance, and Nazi brutality could not be erased by arrows on a map. Tonight, we follow Operation Barbarossa from its first engine noise at the border to the moment it became the invasion that doomed the Third Reich. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. Before dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, the German border road was awake. Engines idled in a low growl, and smoke settled around the boots of soldiers beside trucks. A driver rubbed his hands together, then wiped fuel from his fingers onto his trousers. In his breast pocket, a folded map of the Soviet Union pressed flat against his chest. The map was small enough to carry. The land ahead was not. Officers moved along the column, checking papers and vehicle numbers in the morning light. A tank crewman sat on the edge of a turret, his eyes fixed on the road beyond the border. Another soldier tightened the strap of his pack until the leather cut into his shoulder. None of them could see the front stretching north and south. Operation Barbarossa began that morning as the largest invasion Nazi Germany had ever launched. The attack opened across a huge front, carrying Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union could be smashed before the war became costly. Many Dessau soldiers did not know every detail, but they had absorbed the confidence around them. Poland had fallen, France had fallen, and the road east seemed to wait for the same treatment. The first minutes made that belief easier to hold. Orders moved down the line, engines rose louder, and the first vehicles pushed forward through dust and damp patches of road. Boots crossed the border in silence, or with jokes that died in the engine noise. The men had been told they were stepping into speed. They stepped into the distance. On vehicle hoods, maps made the Soviet Union look like a problem that could be handled with arrows. Leningrad, Moscow and Ukraine lay under pencil marks, neat enough for men in command rooms to discuss over coffee. Roads appeared as thin lines, rivers as blue bends, railways as tools waiting to be seized. The paper did not show the mud inside a ditch, the broken bridge after a retreat, or the driver blinking from lack of sleep while his truck still had 200 kilometers to go. It is almost ridiculous how easily a state can confuse a map for the country itself. The men at the border saw only the first road, the nearest village, and the dark fields ahead. They smelled petrol, wool, leather, and damp soil, not the future smell of burned engines and stalled convoys. A soldier could place one hand on a tank and feel steel, heat, and power. Nazi Germany entered the Soviet Union with real force, but also with dangerous blindness. This was not only a military operation. It was an ideological war, shaped by racism, conquest, and the belief that the people in the East would break under German pressure. Such contempt made the invasion colder and more brutal, but it also made German planning worse. In the first hours, Soviet positions were hit hard. Aircraft were destroyed on airfields, communications were torn apart, and sections of the front were thrown into confusion. German soldiers saw prisoners, abandoned equipment, and villages pass so quickly that they barely noticed faces at windows. Some men believed the promise was proving itself, yet small signs of strain were present from the start. A mechanic knelt beside a truck while oil darkened the skin around his nails. A driver tapped a fuel gauge twice, then looked back toward the rear, where more vehicles were supposed to be coming. Horses stamped and pulled at their traces, while supply carts waited behind columns already bunching on narrow roads. A person today might imagine an army as a smooth machine, but this one still depended on sore backs, cracked hands, tired horses, coughing engines, and cans of fuel that had to arrive before courage became useless. Every kilometre east added another road to guard and cross again with shells, bread, bandages and spare parts. A tank advancing at dawn needed fuel by afternoon. A rifle company still needed water, sleep, and food before the next order could be obeyed. The Soviet Union could be wounded badly, and it was, but it had depth that no border report could make small. Behind the first broken lines were more roads, more towns, more reserves, more factories, and more people than German planners had allied themselves to respect. If Soviet forces did not collapse quickly, the German army would be pulled farther from the depots that kept it alive. For the soldiers, that danger did not arrive as theory. It came as dust sticking to sweat under the collar, as a canteen half empty, as boots rubbing the heel raw before midday. It came as the dull ache in a driver's wrists, as the smell of hot metal from an engine worked too hard, as a glance backward down a road crowded with vehicles waiting to pass. The Great Campaign was also these small discomforts. The first villages looked quiet, but quiet did not mean safe. A woman stood in a doorway with a child pressed against her skirt, and the passing soldiers became part of her mourning. A dog barked once and hid under a cart. Dust settled on window ledges, on vegetable plots, and on the boots of men moving through the opening of a short war. I find it chilling to picture that pale mourning, because the soldiers could still mistake motion for control while the land ahead was already preparing to stretch every weakness they carried. Hitler believed he had opened a door to victory over the Soviet Union. Along the border roads, the first columns made that belief look solid. Metal moved, orders were followed, and the horizon kept giving them more space. By the time the sun rose higher, Barbarossa was no longer an idea in a planning room. It was fuel smoke over fields, maps creased by sweaty hands, wheels grinding into Soviet roads, and young men carried forward by a certainty they had not built themselves. The Third Reich had entered a war that would demand more than speed and early shock could give. The first step had already carried the cost. This first morning gave Nazi Germany the appearance of movement and command. But under the engine noise were distance, supply, and a country too large to be folded into a pocket map. The next part moves into the planning rooms where that false confidence had been drawn long before the first vehicle crossed the border. There, clean arrows ran toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, while broken roads, empty fuel cans, and millions of Soviet lives were treated like dirt that could be brushed off the paper. In German planning rooms, the Soviet Union looked smaller than it was. Large arrows ran across the map toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, drawn confidently. Officers leaned over the table, sleeves brushing paper, pencils tapping near rail lines. A cup of coffee sat cold beside the map. Nobody had to smell the roads there. The plan depended on speed, encirclement, and collapse. Commanders expected armoured spearheads to drive deep to trap Soviet forces and break the enemy before the war became slowest. The Soviet government was expected to shake, the army was expected to lose order, and the country was expected to come apart under pressure. On paper, this looked reasonable to men who had already seen quick victories. Poland had been overrun, France had fallen faster than many had imagined, and the German army had learned to trust the shock of movement. Earlier campaign maps had ended with captured capitals and broken armies. Success made the new map feel obedient. It is frightening how a room full of educated men can make millions of lives look like a scheduling problem. The officers could measure distances with rulers, but not exhaustion. They could count divisions, but not panic. Hunger, stubbornness, mud, or the anger of people facing occupation. They could draw arrows over forests without feeling one boot sink at the roadside. The Soviet Union was not treated as a living country. It was treated as a system that would fail if hit hard enough in the first weeks. German planning assumed huge border battles would destroy enough Red Army forces. Behind that assumption sat Nazi arrogance, which turned contempt into analysis. The table was clean. The country was not. Every major direction carried its own. In the North Ulth, forces would move toward Leningrad. In the center, the road toward Moscow seemed to offer the decisive blow. In the south, Ukraine promised grain industry and space that Germany wanted to seize. The arrows looked separate, but they all demanded fuel, trucks, bridges, railways, and time. That was where the neatness began to crack. German units could move fast at the front, only if the rear kept feeding them. Tanks needed petrol, guns needed shells, men needed bread, horses needed fodder, and the wounded needed transport through the same roads used by supply columns. A commander could push an arrow farther with a pencil, but a driver still had to find fuel. A person looking at a clean campaign map might believe war moves in straight lines, but real war collects in aching wrists, empty stomachs, broken axles, and boots drying badly beside a ditch. The planning rooms did not show drivers sleeping upright behind steering wheels. They did not show mechanics with black oil under their nails, trying to keep engines alive with parts that had not arrived. They did not show horses sweating under loads, while armoured units were far ahead. The belief in Soviet collapse also made time seem less dangerous than it was. If the campaign ended quickly, many weaknesses could be hidden. Bad roads would matter less, railway problems could be solved later, winter clothing would not become urgent, and the vast occupied territory could be handled after victory. A short war forgives many bad guesses. A long war does not. This was a gamble there. It did not only ask German soldiers to defeat Soviet armies. It asked the Soviet state to behave exactly as German planners hoped it would behave. It asked factories, officials, soldiers, civilians, rail workers, commanders and reserves to break in the same direction, at the same speed, under the same pressure. The plan had little patience for delay. Each day lost could turn a confident timetable into a heavier burden. Each broken bridge could slow a column that depended on momentum. Each Soviet unit that escaped encirclement could appear again farther east. Tired but still armed, every sign of survival made confidence safe. I find it unsettling to imagine those arrows lying so smoothly across the table, while the men around them believed the Soviet Union could be made to fit inside their timetable. A map does not argue back. It does not freeze, bleed, retreat, rebuild, or return with new men. It lets the planner feel control before the first wheel touches mud. When the order became movement, the paper confidence went with the soldiers. It sat in officers' cases, in folded maps, in orders passed down through units, and in the belief that the next objective would open the one after it. Men crossed the border, thinking the first hard strike would make the rest easier. For a while, speed made that belief look true. Early success could hide the weakness behind it. German forces would move fast, encircle huge numbers and fill reports with figures that sounded like proof. But behind every victory, the same question waited quietly on the road. What would have happened if the Soviet Union had not broken up? The German plan made the East look conquerable because its arrows were clean, fast, and confident. Once those arrows left the paper, the first weeks of victories would make many soldiers believe the calculation had been right. Ahead of them, long columns of Soviet prisoners, burned villages, and German tanks driving too deep would turn success itself into a trap. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, the German advance looked almost unstoppable. Dust rose behind tanks and trucks as they pushed deeper into Soviet territory, leaving the border far behind them. Columns moved past burned villages, broken carts, abandoned guns, and fields where smoke still hung low over the road. For many soldiers, the maps seemed to be coming true. That made the danger harder to see. Soviet prisoners walked in long lines beside the roads, watched by tired German guards with rifles slung across their chests. Some prisoners had no belts, some held torn caps in their hands, and some stared at the ground as if the dust itself were easier to look at than the men around them. German soldiers passed these columns and saw proof that the enemy was collapsing. Officers marked new gains on maps with quick pencil strokes. The numbers were huge. German forces encircled large Soviet formations, captured weapons, seized towns, and drove forward at a pace that seemed to confirm the promise of a short campaign. Reports moved upward with lists of prisoners, destroyed equipment, and distance covered. To men who already believed in speed, these victories felt like evidence rather than a warning. The army was advancing too well to doubt itself. A soldier riding on a truck might have felt the same thing in his body. The road shook through the wooden bench, dust collected in his mouth, and sweat dried under the collar of his tunic. He could see villages sliding past, sometimes burned, sometimes silent, sometimes crowded with civilians who did not step close to the road. The front seemed to keep moving away from him. It is dangerous when success arrives so quickly that nobody wants to ask what it is costing. Each captured mile looked useful, but each mile also stretched the chain behind the army. The fuel had to travel farther, the bread had to travel farther, the wounded had to be carried farther back, and every bridge, rail line, and crossroads needed men to hold or repair it. Victory was becoming longer than the roads could easily support. The German army had entered the campaign expecting Soviet resistance to break under massive blows. In some places, the blows were devastating. Red Army units were surrounded, headquarters lost contact, and many Soviet soldiers were thrown into confusion by the speed and violence of the attack. From the German side, this seemed to match the story told before the invasion. But the ground gave hints that the story was not complete. A truck driver might stop beside a ditch and rub grit from his eyes, only to hear that the fuel column was delayed again. A mechanic might lie under a vehicle with dust sticking to the oil on his sleeves, trying to fix a problem that should have waited for a proper workshop. A young infantryman might look back down the road and realize the rear had become a world of its own, crowded with prisoners, carts, broken machines, and men searching for their units. The front moved east, but the rear did not become calm. German officers still drew the advance forward. Their map arrows pushed deeper, and early victories made every risk feel temporary. If the Soviet Union was truly about to collapse, then stretched supply lines could be endured for a few more days. If Moscow, Leningrad, or Ukraine could be reached quickly enough, then the discomforts of the road might look like the price of victory. That was the hope. A person reading the campaign later might see the warning at once. but men inside the moving column mostly saw dust, prisoners, burned houses, and another order to keep going. Their world was not a finished history. It was a canteen passed from one hand to another, a bootlace tightened with dirty fingers, a cigarette lit beside a truck, and a rumour that the war could end before autumn. Such rumours were easy to believe when the enemy seemed to be falling back everywhere. The early victories also fed contempt. Some German soldiers began to think the Soviet armies were large but clumsy, brave in moments, but doomed by poor organisation. Nazi ideas had already prepared them to underestimate the people in front of them, and the first weeks gave that prejudice a uniform and a timetable. The sight of prisoners marching west made many men feel that Berlin had been right. It was a comfortable mistake. The landscape did not share that comfort. Roads became longer, villages more unfamiliar, and the horizon kept opening into more fields, more forests, more rivers, more damaged bridges. A soldier could sleep for a few hours beside a truck and wake to find the column moving again before his back had stopped aching. He could eat hard bread with dust on it and still hear that the next objective was farther ahead. I find it unsettling that the first German victories did not slow the illusion but strengthened it. Every success told the army to keep trusting the original plan. Every line of prisoners made the Soviet Union look weaker than it was. Every quick advance made distance feel like something already defeated. Yet the Soviet state had not disappeared. Behind shattered units were new defensive lines, reserves being gathered, industries beginning to move, and commanders trying to rebuild order from disaster. The Red Army had been hit terribly, but it still had room behind it. That room mattered more with every kilometre the Germans advanced. By the end of those first weeks, German soldiers had seen enough victories to believe the campaign might still be short. They had also seen enough dust, delay, and strain to feel a discomfort they could not always name. The maps showed progress, but the roads showed tired men, hot engines, thin supplies, and columns already reaching too far into a country that kept expanding in front of them. Success had not removed the danger, it had hidden it better. The first weeks of Barbarossa gave German soldiers prisoners, captured towns, and the feeling that the Soviet Union was cracking under the blow. But each advance pulled the army farther from its fuel. Bread, repairs, and rest, while the land ahead refused to become smaller. Soon the men who had trusted the arrows on the map would begin to understand distance through empty fuel cans, broken trucks, and supply columns crawling far behind the front. Behind the fast German spearheads, the supply columns moved at a different speed. Trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, bread, spare parts, medical boxes, and sacks crawled along roads already beaten by tanks and wheels. Dust coated the windshields so thickly that drivers wiped small circles with their sleeves just to see the next bend. The front had gone farther than the road seemed ready to follow. That was where victory began to feel heavy. A driver sat hunched over the wheel, his eyes red from dust and poor sleep. His hands were stiff around the rim, and every rut in the road kicked through his arms and shoulders. Beside him, another soldier nodded forward, jerked awake, then pressed one palm against the dashboard as the truck slid into a deeper track. In the back, fuel cans knocked against one another with a dull metal sound. The German advance needed these trucks as much as it needed tanks. A panzer unit could break through a Soviet position, but it still needed petrol by the next halt. Infantry could push through a village, but it still needed bread, cartridges, bandages, and orders. Guns could fire only as long as shells kept arriving behind them. The land made every need harder. In Europe, Many German units had moved through road networks that were easier to use and shorter to manage. In the Soviet Union, the spaces between objectives opened wide and kept opening. Roads turned into rough tracks, bridges were damaged or too weak, and traffic jams formed where one broken vehicle could hold back half a column. The army was not only fighting the Red Army ahead, it was fighting the road under its wheels. It is almost cruel how simple an army looks from the front, while behind it, hundreds of tired men are trying to drag food, fuel, and metal across a country that does not care about schedules. A soldier at the spearhead might see a tank and think of power. A driver behind the front saw cracked tires, overheating engines, empty cans, and men standing in dust with their hands on their hips. The same campaign looked very different from the supply road. Railways were another problem. Soviet rail gauges were different from those used by Germany and much of Western Europe, which meant captured rail lines could not simply be used at full speed without work. Tracks had to be converted, stations repaired, bridges secured, and rolling stock found or adapted. Until that happened, more burden fell onto trucks and horses, already being pushed hard. Enough, some were worn before the campaign began, some broke under rough use, and some disappeared into repair lines that could not keep up. A mechanic might kneel beside a wheel in a field, fingers black with grease, while flies gathered on his neck and dust stuck to sweat under his cap. He could hear the column waiting behind him. No one had time for patience. Fuel became a daily anxiety. Cans were counted, moved, guarded, spilled, lost, and demanded by units that all believed their need was urgent. A tank commander waiting near the front could ask where the petrol was, but the answer might lie many kilometers behind him in a truck stuck in sand, or a convoy delayed at a broken bridge. The war did not stop while men searched for cans. A modern viewer might think the great question was always which army had more courage, but on these roads, courage could sit uselessly beside an engine that would not start. Men still shouted, cursed, pushed, lifted, and tried again. They laid boards under wheels, dug mud from tires, tied ropes to vehicles, and leaned their whole weight into machines that barely moved. The body became part of the transport system. Bread was just as important. Soldiers could talk about ideology, victory, and the destruction of Bolshevism, but after a long day, their thoughts narrowed to water, food, socks, and a place to sit without dust rising into their mouths. A loaf arriving late could sour a whole section's mood. A missed ration could make the next march feel longer than the map suggested. The farther the front moved, the more the rear stretched into confusion. Convoys passed prisoners moving west, wounded men waiting for transport, horse carts with broken harnesses, and field kitchens trying to find units that had already moved on. Officers asked for locations that had changed by the time answers returned. Messengers carried notes that were already old when they arrived. The Soviet Union did not need to defeat every German column at once to damage the advance. Distance was already doing quiet work. It spread vehicles apart, thinned supply, slowed repairs, and made every order depend on roads that might fail under rain, weight, or simple overuse. The army kept moving, but it dragged more behind it every day. I find it unsettling to picture a victorious army being slowly weakened, not by one dramatic defeat, but by dust in the throat, fuel gauges falling toward empty, and drivers fighting sleep while the front moved beyond them. The soldiers at the leading edge might still believe the campaign was racing toward a decision. Behind them, the men with fuel and bread felt the road lengthening under their wheels. Their work became less like support and more like a chase they could not quite win. By evening, a supply column might halt beside a field with engines ticking hot in the cooling air. Men climbed down stiffly, rubbed their eyes, checked tires, counted cans, and tried to swallow bread dry because water was low. Somewhere ahead, tanks waited for what they carried. Somewhere behind, another convoy was already late. The invasion had not stopped. German units were still advancing, still capturing ground, still forcing Soviet formations backward, but the cost of motion was no longer hidden. Each mile east asked for more trucks, more fuel, more repair crews, more drivers, and more time than the plan had comfortably allowed. The road was becoming part of the enemy. The first weeks of Barbarossa gave German soldiers prisoners, captured towns, and the feeling that the Soviet Union was cracking under the blow. But each advance pulled the army farther from its fuel, bread, repairs, and rest, while the land ahead refused to become smaller. Behind the front, empty fuel cans, broken trucks, and exhausted supply columns began to reveal a danger the early victories had covered up. A German panzer looked powerful on a road with its gun facing east. Its tracks pressed deep marks into the dirt, and its crew moved around it with tools, rags, and fuel cans. Up close, it needed a drink. The fuel gauge did not care about victory. A driver crouched beside the tank and wiped dust from the side of a can with his sleeve. Another man leaned into the engine compartment, his fingers black with oil. A third sat in the shade of the hull with his helmet tipped forward, staring down the road toward an objective that still existed only on a map. The tank could not move because the rear had not caught up. This was where the shine of mechanized war began to dull. German armored units could break through lines and turn battlefields into confusion, but they could not run on confidence. They needed petrol, lubricants, spare tracks, filters, repair crews, trucks, tires, and roads that allowed those things to arrive on time. Barbarossa stretched all of that too far. It is almost insulting how quickly a famous war machine becomes useless when the last fuel canister is empty. The crew might still have skill, courage, and orders. The gun might still be clean, and the commander might still point toward the next village. None of that moved the vehicle 1 meter without fuel. The men felt the problem before they fully understood it. It appeared in engines shut off to save petrol, in arguments beside supply trucks, and in mechanics asking for parts that nobody had. A soldier who had slept against the warm metal of the tank now sat with his boots stretched into the dust, watching flies move over bread. His hands still smelled of oil when he lifted the bread to his mouth. The front was not supposed to feel this slow. Tanks were meant to tear forward, close pockets, and trap Soviet forces before recovery. Yet every deep drive created a longer throat behind it, and that throat had to swallow fuel, food, shells, and repairs without choking. It often choked. Roads in the Soviet Union did not have the neat surface that German timetables wanted. Some were dirt tracks that turned to dust in the heat and mud after rain. Railway lines could not simply be used at once because the gauge differed from German standards, and conversion took time and labour. A panzer unit waiting beside a field did not need a lecture on railway gauge. It needed the supply column to appear. Men stood on the road with hands on their hips, squinting into heat and dust, listening for trucks that were not yet there. One man kicked an empty can and watched it roll under the shadow of the track. A person sitting safely in a modern vehicle may think of fuel as a quick stop at a pump. But for these crews, every litre had to travel across captured roads, past broken bridges, through traffic jams, and into a front that kept moving away from its own lifeline. Petrol decided whether the attack continued, whether a wounded man could be carried back, and whether a tank remained a weapon or became a landmark. The army strength rested on containers, hoses, and tired drivers. The machines also wore down. Tracks loosened, engines overheated, tires split, and dust entered places where dust should not be. Crews cleaned, tightened, cursed, and waited. A mechanic's knuckles opened against metal, leaving spots of blood mixed with grease. Men who had been told they were part of a fast campaign now stared at the same field for hours. The target ahead might be only a short distance in words, but words did not repair engines. They did not fill tanks. They did not bring the rear closer. German armoured power had not disappeared, but it was becoming conditional. It was strong when supplied, dangerous when maintained, and frightening when supported by a functioning rear. When those supports frayed, speed shrank into vehicles halted beside a road, crews wiping sweat and asking where the fuel column was. The great machine had ordinary weaknesses. I find it unsettling to imagine the crews looking east with their guns still ready, while their real enemy for the hour was not a Soviet tank, but an empty can lying in the dust. The war around them was enormous, full of ideology, maps, armies, and cities, yet the next movement depended on something small enough for one man to lift. Petrol, oil, bolts, belts, and tires decided whether confidence had any weight. While German tanks stopped, the Soviet Union continued to absorb the blow. It lost men, ground, equipment, and cities, but it did not vanish. Behind the damaged front, new units were gathered, factories were being moved, and orders kept coming through in pain and confusion. A stalled panzer could not see all of that. The crew waited beside the tank as the afternoon lengthened. Dust settled on the gun barrel, on the men's shoulders, and on the map folded near the commander's knee. Someone checked the road again, then looked away without speaking. The objective still lay ahead. The engine was silent. The halted panzer showed how fragile German strength became when fuel, parts, and repairs could not keep pace with the advance. As German vehicles slowed on long Soviet roads, the enemy they had expected to collapse kept absorbing punishment and building new lines behind the smoke. In the villages, forests, and shattered positions ahead, Soviet soldiers who should have been gone kept preparing with rifles in their hands. After one of the early encirclements, the German soldiers believed the area had been emptied. They had watched Soviet prisoners march west in long dusty columns, seen abandoned rifles stacked near the road, and passed wrecked guns with their wheels half buried in dirt. Smoke still rose from a village beyond the fields, and a few German guards leaned against a fence with their helmets pushed back. The battle seemed finished. Then the shooting returned. At first, it was only a few cracks from the trees beyond the road. A soldier turned his head, another dropped behind the side of a truck, and the relaxed faces near the fence tightened at once. The shots did not sound like a full attack, but they were enough to change the feeling of the place. The enemy that had supposedly been destroyed was still somewhere nearby. This happened again and again in different forms. A pocket would be closed, prisoners would be counted, and reports would speak of another Soviet force broken. Then, days later, German units would meet fresh resistance at a village, a river crossing, a strip of woods, or a new defensive line farther east. The same war seemed to restart after every claimed success. It is a strange kind of victory when the enemy keeps appearing after you have already been told he is gone. German soldiers could see the prisoners with their own eyes, and those columns were real. The Soviet losses in 1941 were enormous, and many Red Army units were shattered under the force of the German advance. But destruction on that scale did not mean disappearance. The Soviet Union had depth. It had more land behind the first front, more people to mobilize, and a state that could move, repair, and force itself to continue through disaster. German soldiers at the front did not see the whole process, but they felt its result. A new trench line appeared where an empty road had been expected. A fresh group of Soviet soldiers fired from behind trees. Another village had to be taken. A German infantryman might crouch beside a ditch, pressing his shoulder into the dirt while bullets cut leaves above him. His lips were cracked from dust, his hands smelled of metal and sweat, and his knees hurt from dropping suddenly whenever fire came from a place he thought had been cleared. He could look back at the road and remember the prisoners from yesterday. He could look forward and see rifles firing again. That contradiction worked on the mind. Early in the invasion, German confidence had been fed by movement and numbers. Captured men, destroyed equipment, and fast advances all seemed to prove that the Soviet system was coming apart. But repeated resistance forced a colder question into the ranks. How many times could an army be beaten and still stand somewhere ahead? The answer was not comforting. Behind the front, Soviet authorities were mobilizing new formations, pulling industry eastward, and trying to rebuild command after the shock of invasion. Factories, workers, machines, and supplies began moving away from the German reach. Military units were reorganized, reserves were brought forward, and desperate defensive efforts continued even after terrible defeats. The German army was not fighting only the soldiers in front of it. It was fighting a state with room to bleed and keep moving. A man used to short campaigns could mistake a broken Soviet unit for a broken Soviet Union, but the two were not the same thing. This was one of the most important lessons Barbarossa forced on the invader. A division could be surrounded, a city could be threatened, and thousands of men could be captured. Yet the larger system could still pull new strength from somewhere beyond the horizon. The map kept giving the Germans more land, but the land kept giving the Soviets more time. For the men on the German side, this showed itself in small, irritating details. A march that should have been easy turned into a firefight near a tree line. A supply halt was interrupted by shots from a village edge. A patrol came back with one man missing and another, with blood soaking through the sleeve of his tunic. The road never stayed quiet for long. The frustration grew slowly. Soldiers who had expected to surrender began to tighten their grips on their rifles when they passed the woods. Drivers watched the shoulders of the road instead of only the track ahead. Officers who had marked another victory on a map now had to explain why resistance had appeared behind or beyond it. Every new shot made the last report feel less complete. The Soviet soldiers were not always well supplied or well led in those first months. Many were exhausted, confused, hungry, and thrown into battle under brutal pressure. Some fought from poor positions, some retreated, and some were captured in huge numbers. But enough continued to resist that the German timetable began to feel less safe with every week. I find it unsettling to imagine German soldiers standing beside long columns of prisoners and still hearing rifle fire from the next line of trees. The sight of victory and the sound of unfinished war existed in the same place. One told them the plan was working. The other told them the country ahead had not accepted the result. The more the Germans advanced, the more this problem repeated itself. A battlefield cleared in the morning did not make the roads safe by evening. A village taken one day did not mean the next village would open its doors. A Soviet army damaged in one pocket did not stop another force from forming farther east, where the dust on German boots had not yet reached. The early German victories were still real, but they began to feel smaller within the size of the campaign. Each success required another fight, another march, another supply effort, and another confrontation with an enemy that had been underestimated. Berlin had expected a collapse that would turn battles into administration. Instead, the battles kept returning. The Soviet Union had been badly wounded, but it had not vanished. The German army had captured prisoners, smashed units, and crossed deep into Soviet land. Yet the enemy kept returning from forests, villages, and new defensive lines. This made every victory feel less final, because the ground taken by force still had to be guarded, fed, watched, and controlled. Behind the marching prisoners, hundreds of kilometers of occupied land began to open like a second battlefield. With tired German guards staring at empty villages, they did not have enough men to hold. When a large encirclement ended, the road was filled with Soviet prisoners. They walked in long lines with empty hands, missing belts, torn coats, and boots dragging through dust. German guards stood beside them with rifles held low, their faces grey from heat, dirt, and too little sleep. Behind the column lay hundreds of kilometers of land that German reports now treated as occupied. A guard shifted his weight from one sore foot to the other while the prisoners passed. Dust stuck to his lips, sweat dried under his collar, and his fingers tightened around the rifle whenever the line slowed. He had been told that another Soviet force had been crushed, but the road behind him already felt too wide for the few men left to control it. A village stood in the distance with no clear sign of who was still inside. The numbers looked impressive in German reports. In 1941, German forces captured huge numbers of Soviet prisoners, and each encirclement seemed to support the belief that the Red Army was being destroyed faster than it could recover. Officers counted men, weapons, vehicles, and ground taken. On the map, the pocket was closed, but the ground still had to be held. A road needed guards, a bridge needed sentries, and a railway needed repair crews with rifles nearby. A fuel dump had to be watched through the night because one burning truck could slow an entire column the next morning. Village needed patrols, searchers, orders, and men who could stay there while the front moved farther east. Each victory left work behind it. It is a cruel kind of success when every captured mile becomes another place your tired soldiers must stand and watch. The German army could mark land as taken, but that mark did not patrol a road or repair a bridge. It did not stop a prisoner column from breaking apart. It did not tell a nervous guard whether the shadow at the tree line was a farmer, a scout, or a man waiting with a rifle. The men felt that weight in small ways. One guard rubbed the back of his neck where the helmet strap had left a red line. Another lifted his canteen, shook it, and heard almost nothing inside. A third watched smoke rising from a chimney in a distant village, though no German patrol was supposed to be there. The rear was not calm. The prisoners kept moving. Some stumbled, some leaned on one another, and some stared ahead with the flat look of men too tired to waste strength on expression. German guards walked beside them, with aching calves and dry throats, not knowing whether their next task would be another road, another bridge, or another night beside a depot. The victory had not given them rest. If you value this quieter way of following war history through ordinary details, a like and a subscription help the channel continue this kind of work without rushing to the story. We can keep the pace slow, careful, and human. Now the road opens wider behind the guards. A person might imagine that capturing so many prisoners would make the army safer. But it also meant moving them, guarding them, feeding them badly or not enough, and pulling German soldiers away from the front to manage the results of victory. The battlefield did not vanish after the shooting stopped. It changed into a guarded crossroads, a damaged rail line, a storage yard, a village with shut doors, and a field where nobody knew who might be lying beyond the trees. The success spread sideways. This was one of the strange burdens of Barbarossa. German success created distance faster than Germany could properly secure it. The front demanded more troops to keep advancing, while the rear demanded more troops to hold what German maps had already coloured in. Between those demands stood tired men with rifles and very little certainty. A bridge needed sentries in the rain. A telephone line needed repair after being cut. A railway crew needed protection while working on tracks that did not fit German use without conversion. A prisoner column needed guards walking beside it until their legs ached and their patience thinned. The victory kept asking for more hands. The occupied villages were rarely peaceful in any simple sense. Doors closed when German soldiers entered. Women watched from windows. Old men lowered their eyes, and children stood too still beside fences. A soldier could feel the silence around him, even when nobody moved. The land had been entered, but it had not agreed. I find it unsettling to picture a German guard standing beside a road full of prisoners, while behind his back stretched villages, forests, bridges, and rail lines that his unit did not have the strength to truly hold. His commanders might see a completed encirclement in German reports. His boots, his thirst, and the empty road behind him suggested something less complete. The army was winning battles while becoming thinner across the land it claimed. By evening, the prisoner column might be gone from sight, but the road remained. Scraps of cloth lay in the dust, a broken wheel leaned near a ditch, and flies gathered around a dead horse at the edge of the field. The German guards did not suddenly become free. They still had the bridge to watch, the village to check, the prisoners to count, and the next order to obey. Farther east, the front kept demanding speed. Farther west, the rear kept demanding control. A column of prisoners could prove that a battle had been won, but it also proved that more men were needed away from the main advance. The space behind the army was turning into its own burden. A pocket could close quickly. Holding what came after could last far longer. The Great Encirclements of 1941 gave Germany long prisoner columns and reports that sounded like victory. But they also left behind roads, bridges, villages, railways, and empty spaces that needed more men than the army could spare. As those rear areas spread wider, the war began to grow in places German commanders had not wanted to treat as a front. In the forests and villages behind the advance, cut telephone wires, burned trucks, and sudden shots from the trees would make the rear feel like another battlefield. The road through forest looked emptied until the convoy reached the bend. A German supply truck stood burned at the side of the track, its front wheels twisted toward the ditch and its canvas cover hanging in black strips. The telephone wire sagged from a pole nearby, cut clean and left dangling in the branches. The soldiers in the next truck stopped looking only at the road. They began looking at the trees. A driver leaned over his steering wheel with both hands tight on the rim, his eyes moving from one side of the forest to the other. Dust clung to the sweat on his face, and his jaw worked slowly as if he were chewing on a thought he did not want to say aloud. In the back of the truck, men sat with rifles across their knees, boots pressed against crates of ammunition and tins of fuel. Nobody liked the silence. Behind the main German advance, the war did not become peaceful. Soviet partisans and local resistance groups cut telephone lines, damaged railways, attacked supply columns, guided information to Soviet forces, and forced German occupation troops to spend men and time on security. According to German reports, many of these areas were already behind the front. On the road, they did not feel behind anything. The front had become harder to locate. The convoy moved again, slower now. One soldier watched the left side of the road until his eyes watered from dust and strain. Another kept his thumb near the safety of his rifle, shifting every time a branch moved in the wind. A burned truck was not only wreckage, but a message left in the open. It is a bitter lesson for any invading army when the rear begins to behave like another front. German commanders wanted roads, railways, depots and villages to support the push eastward. Instead, every telephone pole, bridge, rail junction and forest road could become a weak point. A supply route that looked secure in German planning could turn dangerous between one morning and the next. The men in the convoy were not fighting a visible enemy in a line of trenches. They were driving through places where danger could wait, without uniform, without artillery and without warning. A shot might come from a tree line, a mine might sit under loose dirt, and a railway could be damaged just enough to delay supplies at the worst possible moment. This was not the dramatic movement promised by the campaign maps. It was slower and more nervous. A German soldier could handle fear more easily when he knew where to point his rifle. On these roads, his eyes had to search windows, haystacks, fences, tree trunks, and faces near village wells. He could not tell who was frightened, who was angry, who was watching, and who had passed information to someone in the woods. The occupied land kept its secrets. The supply columns mattered because the German army depended on them more with every mile. Fuel, bread, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and mail all had to move across long roads behind the armoured spearheads. A partisan attack did not need to destroy an entire army to matter. Burning one truck, cutting one cable, or delaying one train could add pressure to a system already stretched thin. A person might imagine sabotage as a small act compared with battles between armies. But one cut line could leave a unit waiting for orders, and one burned fuel truck could make several vehicles useless by evening. The German advance had created a huge rear area, but it did not have unlimited men to guard every road and village. Soldiers were pulled from other duties to escort convoys, watch bridges, and patrol forests. The rear kept asking for more attention. The local population did not become a quiet background. Many civilians had seen homes searched, food taken, relatives arrested, or villages placed under harsh control. Some feared the Germans, some hated them, some helped the resistance directly, and many simply tried to survive while armies moved over their lives. German occupation policy made calm harder with each act of cruelty. The convoy passed through a village where doors stayed shut. A woman stood by a fence with her hands buried in her apron, her face still and unreadable. A child watched from behind a window frame until a soldier turned his head, then disappeared from view. The driver looked away first. Nothing there felt settled. I find it unsettling to picture those German supply soldiers till realizing that the land behind them was not resting, but listening. The forest beside the road did not need to move to make them tense. The broken wire, the burned truck, and the closed village doors did enough. Their own rear had begun to press back against them. The strain built up in small habits. Men rode with rifles ready instead of resting. Drivers slowed near bends and bridges. Officers demanded reports on rail lines, roadblocks, missing vehicles, and suspicious movement. Repair crews went out with guards, because even fixing a cable could become dangerous work. Every delay added weight to the front. A panzer unit waiting for fuel did not care whether the fuel was stopped by mud, bad roads, rail problems, or partisans. It only knew the cans had not arrived. The men at the tip of the advance felt the absence before they heard the explanation. By late afternoon, the convoy passed the burned truck and left it behind, but nobody forgot it. The blackened metal remained beside the road like a warning for the next column. In German reports, the route might still be listed as usable. To the men who had driven it, usable did not mean safe. Partisans and local resistance turned the German rear into a nervous space of cut wires. Burned trucks, guarded bridges, and forests watched like enemy trenches. As people Germany tried to control had more reasons to resist, hide, inform, or strike back. Across the villages under Nazi rule, violence would not make the Soviet Union break faster, but would leave families standing in empty kitchens while German soldiers carried away the food. A Soviet village under occupation did not need to be large to feel the weight of the war. German soldiers moved through the yard, opened barn doors, searched sheds, and pushed aside sacks of grain with their boots. Families stood outside in the cold air, hands close to their bodies, watching food, tools, and animals become military property. Inside one house, the kitchen table was bare except for crumbs and a chipped cup. The room had already been emptied. A woman stood near the stove without moving, her fingers pressed into the edge of her apron. An old man kept his eyes on the floorboards while a soldier checked the corner where potatoes had been stored. A child watched from behind a doorway, too afraid to cry loudly, too young to understand why the adults had gone silent. The village did not look like a battlefield, but it had become part of one. Operation Barbarossa was never only a campaign of armies and maps. It was tied to Nazi ideology, racial hatred, conquest, and policies that treated entire populations as obstacles, labor, targets, or resources to be stripped. Soviet civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Jews, and other communities marked by Nazi rule faced hunger, mass violence, forced removal, and murder. The invasion carried crime into the rear as well as fighting into the front. It is hard to call an occupation secure when it teaches the people under it that obedience may still leave them hungry, beaten, or dead. German power could force a village into silence for an afternoon. It could take grain from a barn, pull men into a yard, or leave soldiers posted at a crossroads. But fear did not create loyalty. The violence also damaged German expectations. Nazi leaders had imagined that harshness would help break the Soviet system faster. They believed terror, hunger, and punishment could make occupied areas usable and obedient. Instead, brutality gave many people fewer reasons to believe survival could come through submission. The war became more total because German rule made ordinary life itself unsafe. A village under search showed this clearly. A German soldier could step through a doorway and see not politics, but a coat hanging from a peg, a loaf half cut, a cradle near the wall, and a stove gone cold. He might still follow orders, open cupboards, and check beneath the bed. The family watching him would remember the sound of his boots. The occupation turned kitchens, barns, roads, and wells into places of fear. People learned to hide flour under loose boards, to lower their voices when vehicles passed, and to read the mood of soldiers by how sharply they moved their hands. A mother might divide one small piece of bread between children while keeping her face blank. The body learned caution before the mind had time to explain it. A person today might think of occupation as flags, checkpoints, and official orders, but for civilians, it often arrived as an empty shelf, a missing neighbour, a locked barn, and the knowledge that no door truly belonged to them anymore. These were not small details beside the war. They were the way the war entered daily life. A campaign that had begun with arrows towards cities now reached into cupboards and cellars. German soldiers also lived with the consequences of this violence. The harsher the occupation became, the less peaceful the rear could be. Villagers who might have waited in fear now had reasons to help partisans, hide information, damage equipment, or simply refuse cooperation when they could. Each cruel search made the next road less safe. This did not mean every civilian became a fighter. Many were simply trying to stay alive, protect children, and keep enough food hidden for another day. Some were trapped between German demands, Soviet resistance, and the terror of punishment from either side. But the atmosphere of occupation grew darker because German policy left so little room for trust. A German patrol entering a village could feel that darkness without naming it. Doors closed before the soldiers reached the lane. Faces vanished from windows. Dogs stopped barking after someone pulled them indoors. A man carrying a bucket lowered his eyes too quickly, and a soldier wondered what he had seen in the forest. I find it unsettling to picture a family standing in its own yard while strangers searched the house. Because the scene is quiet enough to seem ordinary until you notice that every ordinary thing has been taken from them. The stove, the grain sack, the cupboard, the table, and the doorway all become evidence of power. Nobody needed to shout for the violence to be clear. The silence did enough. For the Soviet Union, this kind of occupation helped turn the war into a struggle for survival. German brutality confirmed what many already feared. That defeat might not mean peace, but hunger, deportation, imprisonment, or death. Soldiers at the front fought with the knowledge that behind them were homes under threat. Civilians endured with the knowledge that the invader was not simply passing through. The village emptied slowly after the search. German soldiers carried what they wanted to the road, where trucks waited with canvas covers and muddy tires. A woman returned to the kitchen and placed her hand on the table, as if checking whether the house itself was still real. Outside, the old man looked toward the barn and said nothing. The war had left without leaving. German reports could describe security measures, food requisitions, and occupied territory in controlled language. On the ground, those words meant cold rooms, frightened children, missing grain, and people pushed toward hatred by what had been done to them. Barbarossa was supposed to destroy the Soviet strength quickly. Its violence helped make Soviet resistance harder, deeper, and more personal. The occupation did not make the Soviet Union break faster, but pushed fear, hunger, and anger into villages that German maps treated as rear areas. As Nazi violence spread, Soviet leaders and civilians had more reason to turn retreat into total mobilization. Far to the east, factory machines would be ripped from floors, loaded onto trains, and dragged away before German troops could reach them. Inside a Soviet factory, retreat did not look like surrender. Workers unbolted machines from the floor, dragged heavy parts across concrete, and pushed crates toward railway wagons waiting under smoke. Women in thick coats lifted tools, carried metal pieces, and wiped black dust from their cheeks with the backs of their hands. Outside, the city behind them was being prepared to lose what it could not afford to leave. The machines had to move. German forces were advancing, and the Soviet state understood that factories left in place could become useless, captured, or destroyed under extreme pressure. Industrial equipment, workers, specialists, raw materials, and production plans were pulled eastward, away from the German advance. This was not clean or calm. It was an evacuation under fear, noise, shortage, and urgency. A worker might kneel beside a machine he had used for years, turning a wrench with stiff fingers, while another man shouted for more rope. The bolts resisted, the floor was slick with oil, and the air tasted of coal smoke and metal dust. Someone outside called for the next wagon to be loaded, and nobody had time to look back at the walls. The factory was being taken apart while the war moved closer. It is a grim kind of survival when a country must tear up its own industry before the invader can reach it. The Soviet Union had already suffered massive losses, but it did not simply wait for collapse. The state forced people, machines, and labor into motion. Retreat became work. The scale of it was difficult for a German soldier at the front to see. He might only notice that Soviet resistance did not stop after a city fell or a formation was smashed. He might hear that another factory had been captured. Then later, face weapons produced far beyond the area Germany had entered. The Soviet Union was losing ground, but parts of its strength were being dragged out of reach. The railway stations showed the pressure clearly. Machinery sat on flat cars, covered badly with canvas or not covered at all. Workers climbed between wagons, boots slipping on boards, hands raw from rope and iron. Children stood near bundles of clothing, while adults argued over space, tools, and the next departure. Stalin's regime was brutal, and Soviet mobilization came with fear, coercion, and ruthless demands. People did not always choose to sacrifice freely. Orders came from above, and failure could be dangerous. Yet the result was a society being forced into a war effort on a scale German planners had underestimated. Factories moved east toward the Urals, Siberia, and other regions far from the immediate German advance. Production was disrupted, but not destroyed in the way Berlin had hoped. Workers rebuilt machines in cold spaces, unfinished buildings, and rough industrial sites. They worked before walls were complete, before roofs fully protected them, and before proper living conditions existed. A person today might imagine a factory as something fixed to one address, but in wars machines were pulled from floors, chained onto trains, and carried into the east like wounded organs of a country trying to stay alive. That image mattered more than any speech. A lathe, a press, or a milling machine could become as important as a rifle. Without tools, there would be no rifles later. The human cost sat in every corner of the evacuation. A woman could lift a crate until her arms shook, then stop only long enough to retie a scarf around her hair. An old worker could run his thumb along the edge of a machine and leave a clean streak through the grease, knowing he might never see the old factory again. A boy could carry bolts in both hands because every small part mattered. The German invasion aimed to break the Soviet Union quickly. Instead, it pushed the Soviet state into a desperate reorganization. Men were pulled into the army, women and teenagers filled more labor roles, and entire communities were tied to production, transport, and survival. The line between soldier and civilian became harder to separate. On German maps, captured territory looked like progress. In German reports, the advance could still sound impressive, but the living center of Soviet resistance was not all sitting in the places Germany had already reached. It was moving, rebuilding, and learning to keep producing under conditions that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. I find it unsettling to picture those trains moving east through smoke and cold, loaded not with comfort but with machines, workers, and the stubborn remains of a war effort Germany had expected to crush. Every wagon carried delay for Hitler's timetable. Every machine removed from a threatened city made the invasion less decisive. Every worker who rebuilt production far away helped turn space into a weapon. The retreat also changed morale in a harsh way. It did not feel glorious to abandon a factory, a house, or a street where people had spent years of their lives. It felt like loss, confusion, and fear. But inside that loss was a message that Germany had misread from the beginning. The Soviet Union could bend backward without breaking at once. It could give up ground while saving machinery. It could absorb panic and still issue orders. It could suffer badly and still make the next month harder for the invader than the last. At the factory station, the final wagons groaned as they began to move. Workers walked beside them for a few steps, hands resting on cold metal, then let go as the train pulled away. Behind them, smoke covered the city they were leaving. Ahead of the train lay the distance Germany would have to fight through to reach. For the German soldier at the front, this meant time was no longer empty. Every week that passed allowed more Soviet forces to reorganize, more factories to restart, and more resistance to harden. The army pushing east was not only chasing land, it was chasing a country that had begun moving its strength beyond the horizon. The Soviet retreat was not a simple collapse, because machines, workers, and military production were being dragged east while German troops advanced through smoke and abandoned streets. As Soviet industry moved beyond immediate German reach, the invasion began to face an enemy that could survive longer than Berlin had planned. On the roads to Moscow, German soldiers would soon discover that the calendar itself had turned against them, with dust giving way to cold rain and wheels sinking into the first deep mud. An officer looked down at the date in his notebook and held the page flat against the rain. The paper had softened at the corners, and the pencil marks from earlier days had begun to blur under damp fingers. Around him, trucks that had once raised dust now sat with their wheels sunk into brown mud. The road to Moscow no longer looked like a road. It looked like a trap underfoot. The German army still moved east, but the feeling of movement had changed. In summer, engines had roared over dry tracks, boots had kicked up dust, and the front had seemed to run ahead of every warning. Now the rain fell into ruts. The ruts became trenches for wheels, and vehicles leaned at awkward angles while men pushed from behind. Every mile took more time than the maps had promised. Barbarossa had depended on speed from the beginning. It needed the Soviet Union to collapse before distance, weather, supply, and fatigue could gather together. By autumn, those things were no longer separate problems. They were all standing on the same road, wrapped in cold rain and mud. The timetable was beginning to rot. It is almost pathetic how quickly a confident timetable can lose its authority once a truck sinks to its axle in mud. An officer could still write the next objective in a notebook. A commander could still demand movement toward Moscow. But a driver staring at spinning wheels did not need another order. He needed the earth to let go. The Rasputitsa made every simple task heavier. Soldiers climbed down from trucks and sank to their ankles, then to their calves, while trying to hook cables under bumpers. Their gloves became soaked, their sleeves darkened with mud, and their boots made wet sucking sounds each time they tried to step back. A man could pull with all his strength and still watch the vehicle settle deeper. The mud did not care about rank. It caught staff cars, supply wagon, artillery pieces, motorcycles and ambulances with the same slow patience. Horses strained in harnesses with their ribs working under wet hides. Drivers cursed quietly through clenched teeth, not because shouting would help, but because silence felt worse. The road held everything. German reports could still speak of operations, advances, and pressure toward Moscow. On the ground, those words passed through hands stiff with cold and ropes rubbed raw with use. A panzer unit waiting for fuel could not move faster because the headquarters wanted it. A supply column could not deliver bread if half its trucks were buried in a road that had turned into paste. A person today might imagine delay as a line on a screen or a late vehicle in traffic, but here, delay meant wet socks, numb fingers, empty stomachs, and men pushing metal through mud while the enemy gained another hour. Time became physical. It stuck to wheels, soaked into coats, and made each repair take longer. It entered the body through cold rain. The soldiers felt it changing before they fully understood its meaning. Breath showed faintly in the morning. Hands stayed stiff after waking. Men slept under damp blankets and rose with mud already hardened on their trousers. The first jokes about the weather became shorter, then disappeared. The march toward Moscow still carried urgency, but the urgency no longer created speed. It created irritation. Officers looked at watches and maps with tighter faces. Drivers kept asking when the road would improve, and nobody had an answer worth believing. The army was still trying to win a summer war in autumn conditions. The Red Army remained ahead of them, battered but not gone. Soviet resistance continued to appear at villages, river lines, roadblocks and defensive positions that slowed the advance further. Each fight used fuel, ammunition, strength and daylight. Each delay pushed the German army closer to weather it had not planned to face so deeply inside Soviet territory. I find it unsettling to picture those men learning that the enemy was not only in uniforms ahead of them, but also in the calendar hanging silently over every muddy road. A day lost to rain did not look dramatic on a battlefield map. It did not explode or shout. It simply made the next day harder. The supply situation worsened with the mud. Trucks burned more fuel moving a shorter distance. Parts broke under strain. Men spent hours freeing vehicle only to find another stuck farther ahead. A convoy that should have fed the front by evening might still be visible from the same bend in the road after dark. In the cab of one truck, a driver sat with both hands still on the wheel after the engine had been switched off. Mud covered the windshield edges, and water dripped from his cap onto his cheeks. He looked at the line of vehicles ahead, then at the line behind. Both seemed to vanish into the same grey rain. The German army had not been defeated by mud alone. That would be too simple. Soviet resistance, distance, supply weakness, command choices, losses, and false assumptions all pressed together. But the mud made those weaknesses visible in a way no speech could hide. A boot pulled free slowly. A wheel spun uselessly. A man lowered his head and pushed again. By this stage, the promise of a fast victory had begun to sound less like certainty and more like a deadline already missed. The soldiers had entered the Soviet Union believing the campaign could be finished before the war conditions arrived. Now autumn had arrived around them, and Moscow still lay ahead. The road itself had become an argument against the plan. The German drive toward Moscow did not stop in one clean moment, but slowed through rain, mud, exhausted drivers, strained horses, and vehicles that could not move when speed mattered most. As autumn deepened, the war that was supposed to end quickly became a daily struggle against roads that swallowed wheels and men alike. In the mud ahead, soldiers would soon be pulling trucks with ropes, digging with bare hands, and watching the idea of mechanized war sink axle deep into the earth. The truck leaned sideways in the rut, as if the road had grabbed it by the wheels. Mud reached almost to the axle, thick and brown, clinging to the tires in heavy layers that would not shake loose. A German soldier pulled off one glove with his teeth so he could fix a cable under the front bumper. His bare fingers went straight into cold mud. The wheel spun anyway. Around the truck, men stood with their boots sunk deep enough that every step required effort. One leaned his shoulder against the side panel, another wrapped both hands around a rope, and a third used a shovel to cut wet earth away from the tire. Rain tapped on helmets and ran down collars. Nobody looked proud. This was what Rasputitsa did to mechanized war. The German campaign had been built around movement, fast blows, and armoured units pushing through before the enemy could recover. But many Soviet roads were not the hard, dependable roads that German planning needed. When autumn rain soaked them, they could turn into long strips of mud where engines roared, and nothing moved. It is humiliating for an army built on speed to find itself defeated for an hour by a patch of wet earth. The men could still hear the engine working. They could still see the road ahead. They could still know that orders wanted them forward. The mud did not answer orders. A soldier bent forward and pulled on the rope until the veins stood out in his neck. His boots slid backward, his knees bent, and mud splashed across his coat as the truck lurched only a few inches. Another man cursed under his breath and wiped rain from his eyes with a sleeve that was already soaked. The truck settled again as if it had grown heavier. The problem was not one stuck vehicle. It was the road behind it, the road ahead of it, and the vehicles waiting in both directions. A supply truck stuck in mud could block ammunition, food, fuel, medical wagons, and repair teams. A gun that could not move could not support the next attack. An ambulance stuck in the same road turned wounded men into cargo that nobody could move quickly. The battlefield narrowed to a rut. German reports could still describe operations and objectives, but the men on the road measured progress by rope marks in their palms. Their fingers grew numb from cold water, then burned when they gripped metal hooks. Mud worked into socks, under trouser cuffs, into gloves, and beneath fingernails. Every task took twice as long and left the body slower afterward. A person today might imagine mud as an inconvenience on a dirty path, but here it became a system of delay that entered boots, engines, wheels, rifles, stomachs, and tempers. Men did not only walk through it, they carried it. It hung from their clothes, weighted their feet, cooled their skin, and made every movement feel older than the man making it. The machine suffered too. Tires lost grip, tracks packed with dirt, engines overheated under strain, and parts wore down faster than repair crews could manage. A mechanic lying beside a truck had mud pressed into his shoulder and oil spreading across his sleeve. When he reached for a tool, his hand slipped because everything was wet. Even repair became a fight against the ground. For armoured units, this was more than discomfort. Blitzkrieg needed pace, coordination, and the ability to exploit openings quickly. Mud broke that rhythm into fragments. A tank might move, then wait for fuel. Fuel might arrive, then be blocked by another vehicle stuck on a narrow road. An order might be urgent, but urgency did not make wheels bite. A driver sat inside the cab and kept one hand on the steering wheel while men pushed from behind. The windshield was streaked with mud and rain, and his eyes looked swollen from lack of sleep. He listened for instructions through the engine noise, then pressed the pedal again. The truck shook, spat mud, and remained where it was. The sound was useless power. This slowed the front and deepened the strain behind it. Men who should have been resting after marches spent hours digging, pushing, dragging, and repairing. Soldiers who had imagined themselves moving through a campaign of sharp decisions became labourers in a landscape that would not support the decision already made. Their bodies became part of the transport system. I find it unsettling to picture those soldiers standing in mud to their knees, because the Great Invasion suddenly looks less like a machine of conquest and more like tired men trying to pull their own war out of the ground. The tanks and trucks were still there, the guns were still there, the ambition was still there, but the road would not release them. Cold rain made the exhaustion worse. Men ate with dirty hands because there was no clean place to wash them. Bread carried grit from the same fingers that had handled cables and shovels. A soldier could lift food to his mouth and taste mud before he tasted anything else. Even a pause did not feel like rest. The front kept asking for movement. Moscow still lay ahead, and Soviet resistance still forced German unités to spend more fuel, ammunition and strength. The delay caused by mud gave the defenders more time, and time had become one of the things Germany could not afford to waste. The campaign was no longer only fighting the Red Army, it was fighting the road under its own wheels. By evening, the truck finally came free, with a wet jerk that sent two men stumbling backward. Nobody cheered for long. Another vehicle had stopped farther ahead, sunk deeper near a bend where water had collected in the track. The soldiers picked up the rope again, shoulders lowered and faces blank. The day had not moved far. The autumn mud turned German mechanized war into a slow struggle of ropes, shovels, numb fingers, and boots dragged from the earth one step at a time. As vehicles crawled forward through Rasputitsa, the weather began exposing every weakness that speed had once covered. After the mud came a colder punishment. With rifles freezing, oil thickening, and German soldiers wrapping rags around their ears because their winter clothing had not arrived. A German soldier near Moscow wrapped a scarf around his ears and pulled it tight with cracked fingers. His breath came out white and thick, hanging for a moment before the wind tore it apart. The rifle in his hands felt stiff, and the metal seemed to bite through the thin gloves. His coat had not been made for this depth of cold. The cold found every gap. Snow settled on helmets, vehicle hoods, gun barrels, and the shoulders of men who stood too tired to brush it off. A driver tried to start a truck while another soldier held a lamp close to the engine. Both of them bent over the machine as if warmth could be forced into it by staring. Oil thickened, parts resisted movement, and batteries weakened in the freezing air. What had been difficult in mud now became painful in ice. It would be too simple to say that winter alone defeated the German army. The cold was severe, and it punished the soldiers hard, but the deeper failure had been carried on since summer. Supply lines were already stretched, vehicles were worn bore down, units had lost men. Soviet resistance had continued, and the distances had already eaten into the original plan. Winter did not create all those problems, it exposed them. It is too convenient to blame the weather when the army had spent months marching into a country it had misunderstood. The frost made the weakness visible on faces, hands, weapons, and roads. A soldier could no longer pretend the campaign was still running on the same timetable. He could feel the delay in his fingertips. The men tried to improvise. They wrapped rags around their boots, stuffed paper under clothing, and pulled extra cloth over their ears. Some rubbed their hands together until the skin split. Others breathed into their gloves before touching rifle bolts or metal tools. Every small action had to be done with care. Cold changed the body before it changed the map. Feet numbed inside boots. Fingers lost feeling, then burned when blood returned. Men slept badly because the ground pulled heat from them through blankets and coats. A soldier waking before dawn might need several moments to make his hands obey. The weapons and vehicles suffered beside the men. Rifle bolts could freeze, or become difficult to work with. Engines needed more care before they would start. Fuel and lubricants behaved differently in low temperatures, and crews already short of proper equipment had to fight the machines before they could fight the enemy. The army's tools became stubborn. A person today might think of cold as discomfort, but for these soldiers it entered the rifle bolt, the engine oil, the boot leather, the wound dressing, and the breath of every man standing outside. It slowed hands, stiffened cloth, and turned simple repairs into long struggles. A missing winter coat was not a minor inconvenience. It could decide whether a man could stay useful at the front. The German soldiers near Moscow also faced an enemy that had not collapsed. Soviet forces were still there, defending approaches, forming lines, and preparing to strike back. The Red Army had suffered terribly, but it had not vanished into the snow. In places where German commanders had expected exhaustion and collapse, they found more resistance. This made the cold feel more bitter. A man could look toward Moscow and know the city was close in one sense, yet unreachable in another. The distance on the map had shrunk, but the strength needed to cross it had shrunk as well. Trucks stood white with frost, horses lowered their heads, and soldiers stamped their feet without getting warm. In German reports, the army could still describe positions, advances, shortages, and enemy activity. On the ground, the report became a man trying to free a frozen strap with teeth that chattered. It became a crew brushing snow from a gun sight. It became a sentry shifting from one foot to the other while his ears went numb beneath cloth. The larger failure was written in small movements. I find it unsettling to picture a soldier standing that close to Moscow, because victory could seem near, while his own body was already telling him the campaign had gone too far. He did not need a full strategic explanation. His hands, boots, rifle, and empty stomach explained enough. The promise of a quick war had reached a place where it could no longer hide from the season. Winter did not act alone. It joined the distance, the bad roads, the strained supply lines, the Soviet refusal to collapse, and the losses from the months before. All of those problems had been walking with the German army since June. The snow simply made them stand in the open. A soldier tightened the scarf around his ears again and looked toward the grey horizon. Moscow was still not in German hands. The engine behind him coughed once, failed, and went silent. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. The winter before Moscow did not defeat Germany by itself, but it made every mistake of Barbarossa visible in frozen rifles, stalled engines, cracked hands, and men wrapped in rags against the cold. As the German army shivered outside the Soviet capital, the distance to victory became larger than the distance on the map. Ahead, officers would raise binoculars toward Moscow, while behind them stood broken vehicles, exhausted units, and soldiers too cold to believe the city was truly within reach. Near Moscow, a German officer raised binoculars toward the grey horizon and held them there until his fingers stiffened around the metal. Snow moved across the open ground in thin, restless sheets, blurring the distance and making every dark line look like a possible road ridge or treetop. Men nearby said the city was no longer far, and on the map that sounded almost true. Behind them, the road told another story. The army had arrived worn down. Trucks stood at odd angles along the roadside, some with open engine covers, some with wheels sunk into frozen ruts. Soldiers moved around them slowly, wrapped in scarves, blankets, and whatever extra cloth they had found. A mechanic leaned into an engine with his shoulders hunched, breathing into his hands before touching the metal again. The cold made even repair work feel like punishment. Moscow was close enough to become a word passed from mouth to mouth. The name carried pressure, hope, and a kind of exhaustion that nobody wanted to admit openly. German units had advanced deep into Soviet territory, won battles, captured prisoners, and pushed through months of dust, mud, and cold. In German reports, the approach to Moscow could still sound like the last stage of a great campaign. It is a bitter thing to stand near the prize and realize that reaching it on a map is not the same as having the strength to take it. The distance had shrunk, but the army had shrunk with it. Vehicles had broken, horses had died, units had lost experienced men, and supply lines stretched back across roads that had already been punished by mud and frost. The front was close to Moscow, but it was also far from the condition it had been in June. A soldier standing beside a ditch could feel that difference in his own body. His boots were stiff, his socks damp, and his hands slow around the rifle. When he turned his head, he could see gaps in the unit where familiar faces had been replaced, or simply not replaced at all. The winter air made each breath visible, as if even breathing had become part of the burden. The Soviet capital had not fallen. Soviet forces were defending the approaches, preparing positions, bringing up reserves, and fighting with the knowledge that this city mattered beyond one point on a map. German soldiers could see smoke, distant movement, and signs of resistance ahead. The enemy was still there. The promise of quick collapse had travelled a long way and arrived badly damaged. Every earlier delay now stood near Moscow with the troops. The bad roads were in the stalled trucks. The fuel shortages were there in vehicles that could not be risked without certainty. The underestimated Soviet endurance was there in the defensive lines ahead. If you appreciate this slow, grounded way of following war history through the small details soldiers actually felt, a like and a subscription help the channel keep telling these stories carefully. It allows us to stay with the human cost behind the maps without rushing past the mud, cold, and fear. Now the road outside Moscow grows even narrower. A person today might imagine being close to a capital as being close to victory, but for those soldiers, closeness meant frozen straps, empty fuel cans, tired horses, missing coats, and officers staring at maps that no longer matched the men around them. The army could still attack. It could still bring guns forward and issue orders, but the system carrying those orders had been ground down for months. A German officer folded a map and tucked it back into his coat, though the creases had grown soft from use. He knew the city lay ahead, but he also knew what lay behind him. Broken vehicles, delayed supplies, reduced companies, wounded men, and roads that could barely carry the weight still being demanded of them. He did not need to say all of it. The men saw enough. They saw horses standing with heads low, their breath rising in cantos. They saw soldiers cutting frozen bread with numb fingers, passing pieces without much talk. They saw rifles checked again and again because the cold made every mechanism feel less certain. They saw the same grey sky every morning and the same city still not taken. This was the cruel shape of the Moscow front. Hope remained because the city was close. Fear remained because the army no longer felt strong enough to turn closeness into success. Each step forward required more than the men wanted to admit. Each pause gave the Soviets time. I find it unsettling to picture those German soldiers near Moscow, because the city could seem almost within reach while everything behind their shoulders showed how much Barbarossa had already consumed. A man could raise his eyes toward the horizon and imagine the end of the campaign. Then he could look down at his cracked hands and remember that the body does not obey ambition forever. Even confidence had become tired. German commanders still wanted movement. The pressure to take Moscow was immense, and the campaign had already invested too much blood, fuel, and time to stop easily. Yet the closer the army came, the more visible its weakness became. It was not only fighting Soviet troops now, but also the damage of its own advance. The snow covered some of that damage, but not enough. It lay on burned vehicles, on abandoned equipment, on rifle barrels, on carts, on boots, and on the shoulders of men waiting for orders. It made everything look still for a moment. Underneath, the system was strained and trembling. A soldier lowered himself onto the edge of a frozen ditch and rubbed his hands together under his sleeves. Somewhere ahead, Soviet guns waited. Somewhere behind, another supply column struggled forward with too little of what the front needed. Moscow remained in the distance, close enough to haunt them. Before Moscow, the German army was not stopped by one problem, but by the weight of months of distance, losses, cold, bad roads, and Soviet resistance gathering at once. As the exhausted advance stalled outside the capital, the Red Army was no longer only holding the line. In the freezing fog ahead, Soviet guns would open. German soldiers who thought they were preparing to endure winter would be forced backward, and abandoned vehicles would be left standing in the snow. The Soviet artillery began in the snow before many German soldiers fully understood what was happening. The sound rolled through the frozen woods, dull at first, then heavier, until the white air seemed to shake around the trees. Men who had been thinking about shelter, fires, and surviving the winter suddenly reached for rifles with stiff fingers. They had expected cold and waiting. They received movement. A German soldier crouched near a shallow position with frost on his sleeves and snow gathered along the edge of his helmet. His scarf had slipped below one ear, but he did not fix it because both hands were on his weapon. Around him, men looked toward with the sound of Soviet guns, then toward officers who were already shouting for units to form and move. The faces were tired before the fighting even began. In December 1941, the Red Army launched its counter-offensive before Moscow. German forces that had pushed toward the Soviet capital were hit by fresh Soviet attacks in brutal winter conditions. The city had not fallen, and the army that was supposed to collapse had found enough strength to strike back. In German reports, this was not the ending Berlin had promised. The snow hid nothing important. The first shock was not only the firing itself, but the direction of the pressure. German soldiers had spent months pushing east, even when exhausted, even when slowed by mud, supply shortages, and cold. Now, near Moscow, the motion changed. Men who had believed they were near the final prize were ordered to pull back through the same frozen roads they had struggled to reach. It is a hard thing for an army to discover that the enemy it expected to finish is now strong enough to push it away from the prize. The Soviet counteroffensive did not erase all German power at once, but it struck directly at the belief that Barbarossa was still a short campaign. The idea of quick victory had already been weakened by distance, mud, winter, and Soviet endurance. Now it cracked in the open. A soldier might feel that crack before he could name it. He could see men lifting wounded comrades onto sledges or vehicles that barely worked in the cold. He could hear engines coughing, officers calling out new positions, and the sharp sound of branches breaking under boots in the snow. He could smell smoke from guns and frozen breath trapped in scarves. The front was no longer moving the way the German camp wanted it to move. The retreat was not clean. Vehicles stood abandoned where engines failed, fuel ran short, or roads became impossible. Men pulled what they could from trucks before leaving them, hands moving quickly over crates, blankets, ammunition, and food. A driver might sit for one last second behind the wheel, staring at the dashboard, before climbing down and walking away. Machines that had carried the invasion forward now froze beside the road. German soldiers had feared winter, but many had expected to endure it in some kind of fixed position near victory. Instead, they were forced into movement under pressure. Pulling back in snow is different from standing still in snow. It means carrying weapons, dragging supplies, helping wounded men, watching for Soviet attacks, and trying not to lose the unit in forests and white fields. A person today might think of retreat as simply moving backward, but for these men it meant numb feet, slipping boots, burning lungs, abandoned vehicles, shouted orders, and the sick feeling that the whole campaign had changed direction. Every step away from Moscow carried more than physical distance. It carried the loss of a promise. The war was no longer behaving like a German victory waiting to be completed. The Soviet troops pressing forward were also exhausted by war, loss, and cold. But they were attacking with a force the Germans had not expected at this stage. Fresh units, including formations better prepared for winter conditions, helped drive the counteroffensive. Soviet defense before Moscow had hardened into action. The line that Germany had tried to break became the place where Germany was pushed back. For the German soldier, this could feel unreal. Only months earlier, prisoners had filled roads. Soviet equipment had been abandoned, and officers had spoken of collapse. Now those same roads were scenes of German confusion. Snow covered the tracks of vehicles leaving positions they had paid heavily to reach. The old certainty no longer fits the view. A man might stop beside a burned vehicle and press one hand against his side, breathing hard through cloth stiff with frost. He might look back toward the sound of Soviet fire and then forward toward a road crowded with men, carts, horses, and wounded. Nobody around him needed a speech about strategy. The cold road explained enough. I find it unsettling to picture those German soldiers being forced backward before Moscow, because the real collapse in that moment was not only a line on the map, but the belief that the war in the East could still be short-put. They were not just losing ground. They were losing the story that had carried them into the Soviet Union. That loss would follow them far beyond the snow outside the capital. The counteroffensive made clear that the Soviet Union had survived the first terrible blow. It had lost enormous numbers of men, territory, equipment, and cities, but it had not broken in the way Hitler had expected. The war would not end before winter. It would not end with one fast campaign. The German army remained dangerous, and the fighting in the east would continue with terrible force. But after Moscow, Barbarossa could no longer be understood as a clean road to victory. The invasion had opened something much larger than the plan had allowed. It had become a war of endurance. By evening, some German units moved back through forests where snow-covered branches erased old tracks. Men walked with heads lowered, rifles held close, coats stiff with frost, and faces too tired for anger. Behind them, abandoned vehicles stood white and silent near the road. Ahead of them was not safety, only more war. The Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow broke the belief that Barbarossa could still end as a fast German victory. As German soldiers pulled back through snow, the campaign changed from a promised decision into a struggle that would consume men, machines, fuel, and time month after month. Beyond Moscow, the war would no longer be about one great breakthrough, but about a grinding contest where every trench, factory, rail line, and replacement soldier became part of a vast war of exhaustion. After Moscow, the map no longer looked like a clean promise. The old arrows had lost their force, and in their place were long front lines, bulging positions, exhausted units, empty depots, and roads that seemed to lead everywhere except to a final decision. Officers still leaned over paper, but their hands moved more slowly now. The campaign had stopped behaving like a campaign. It had become a burden. In the early months, German power had been built around speed. Armoured units broke through, infantry followed, pockets closed, and commanders looked for the next movement before the enemy could recover. That method had worked well enough in earlier campaigns to become almost a habit of belief. In the Soviet Union, it had carried the army deep into the east, but it had not ended the war. Now the war demanded different things. It demanded replacements for dead and wounded men, shells for guns that fired day after day, fuel for vehicles that had already been worn hard, food for soldiers spread across a huge front, and industrial strength that could keep feeding the struggle through month after month. It demanded patience, depth, and endurance. Germany had not entered Barbarossa to fight that kind of war. It is a cold punishment when the war you plan to finish quickly becomes the exact kind of war your system was not built to survive. A fast campaign can hide shortages for a while. A long campaign exposes them in every depot, every repair yard, every casualty list, and every company that waits for men who do not arrive. The Eastern Front began to ask for more than Germany could give easily. A German clerk in a rear office could see the change in names and numbers. He turned pages in a casualty book, crossed out men, entered missing reports, and wrote unit strengths that looked thinner each week. The ink dried faster than replacements came. Outside, a truck waited for parts that were not in the storehouse. The soldiers at the front felt the same truth without needing figures. A platoon that had once filled a trench now spread itself across the same ground with fewer bodies. Men shared ammunition more carefully, patched torn coats, and learned which comrades were too tired to trust on night watch. In a dugout, a soldier might hold a cup with both hands just to feel a little warmth. The war had become smaller in the body and larger on the map. German reports could still describe attacks, captured villages, and lines held. The army was still dangerous, still capable of fighting hard, still able to win battles. But after Barbarossa failed to destroy the Soviet Union quickly, each victory carried a different meaning. It no longer promised an end. It asked for another effort. A person today might imagine a battle as something decided in one place, but the Eastern Front became a vast account book of fuel, steel, sleep, winter clothing, railway repair, trained crews, and men whose bodies could not simply be replaced when they disappeared. The war of movement had turned into a war of consumption. Every attack consumed shells. Every march consumed fuel. Every frozen night consumed strength. The Soviet Union had suffered enormously, yet it had space, population, production, and a brutal ability to keep forcing resources into the fight. Its fact moved east, its armies rebuilt, and its losses did not produce the collapse German planners had expected. Germany had wanted a decisive blow, but the enemy had survived long enough to change the terms of the struggle. That was the trap opening wider. The Eastern Front began to drain the Third Reich in ways that reached beyond the snow and forests. Tanks needed replacement. Aircraft needed fuel and parts. Experienced officers and NCOs could not be recreated by order. Horses died, trucks failed, and railway lines required constant work. The front ate everything. A soldier in a dugout could hear this through absence. The mail came less regularly. Warm clothing arrived too late or in too few bundles. The ammunition stack looked smaller than the day before. A man asked when replacements were coming, and the answer was a shrug, I find it unsettling to picture Germany still winning fights while already being pulled into a contest where winning another fight did not solve the larger problem. That is what made the shift so dangerous. The army could still advance in places, still punish Soviet forces, still create impressive lines in reports. But the war had stopped offering the short road Hitler had promised. The longer it continued, the more the original gamble of Barbarossa spread into every part of German strategy. More men were tied down in the east. More equipment was consumed there. More fuel, trucks, shells, and replacements were pulled toward a front that refused to close. The invasion that was supposed to secure German power had become the place where that power leaked away. In a command post, an officer looked at a map covered not with clean arrows but with positions, gaps, supply notes, and units needing rest. A candle burned low near the edge of the table. His gloves lay beside a cold cup, stiff with dried mud. Nobody in that room could draw a simple line to victory anymore. The map had become honest. After Moscow, Barbarossa no longer looked like a shortcut, but like the beginning of a vast war of exhaustion that Germany had not prepared to win. As the Eastern Front kept swallowing men, fuel, machines, and time, the pressure would spread into every other part of the Third Reich's war. Soon, Germany would be forced to fight in the east, guard the west, spend strength in North Africa and the Atlantic, and still pretend one empire had enough blood and steel for all of it. On a German map of Europe, the war no longer sat in one place. The east stretched across a vast line of forests, rivers, cities, fields, and supply routes that kept demanding more men. To the west, Britain remained beyond the Channel. The Atlantic still needed ships and aircraft, and North Africa still pulled fuel, vehicles, and attention into another harsh theatre. The map had too many mouths. The Eastern Front was the largest. Barbarossa had been opened with the belief that a quick victory in the Soviet Union would make Nazi Germany stronger. Instead, the campaign created a front that began to swallow the strength meant for every other war Germany still had to fight. Tanks, trucks, shells, fuel, aircraft, horses, trained crews and replacement soldiers were pulled east in huge quantities. The more the Soviet Union refused to collapse, the more the rest of Germany had to live with what the East consumed. In command officers, this pressure appeared as requests, shortages, and arguments over priorities. A staff officer could run one finger along the Eastern Front and see a line so long that it seemed to bend the whole room around it. On another section of the map, North Africa needed fuel and vehicles. At sea, the Atlantic demanded ships, aircraft, crews, and production. Everything wanted steel. It is a strange kind of conquest when the land you invade begins taking more from you than you can take from it. Germany had entered the Soviet Union looking for a decision, resources, and strategic freedom. What it found was a war that tied down divisions, ate fuel, wore out machines, and filled casualties lists faster than the system could comfortably replace them. The invasion did not free German power, it pinned it. The pressure was not dramatic in one single moment. It gathered through seasons, through campaigns, through broken vehicles waiting for parts, through trains carrying ammunition east instead of somewhere else. It gathered in depots where officers counted fewer spare tires than needed. It gathered in letters reporting men missing, wounded, frozen, sick, or dead. A German soldier in the East did not need to think about global strategy to feel it. He noticed that replacements arrived late, that some were younger or less experienced, and that equipment was patched rather than new. He saw horses pulling loads that trucks should have carried. He saw mechanics stripping parts from ruined vehicles. because the official supply system could not make damaged machines whole fast enough. The Third Reich was still dangerous, but it was stretched. A person today might imagine a great power fighting several fronts, as if each front had its own separate strength. But every litre of fuel, every trained mechanic, every gun barrel, and every soldier sent east was something not available somewhere else. The Eastern Front became the largest claim on German resources. It turned strategy into subtraction. Reinforcing one place meant weakening another, or delaying what another front needed. This was the consequence of failing to end the Soviet war quickly. If the Soviet Union had collapsed as Hitler had hoped, Germany could have turned its strength elsewhere with more freedom. But after Moscow, the East became a permanent demand. It was not a completed campaign. It was a wound that required fresh bandages every day and still kept bleeding. In German reports, units might still hold lines, prepare attacks, or receive orders for new operations. On the ground, the cost showed in small scenes. A soldier counted the men in his squad and noticed how few original faces remained. A driver warmed his hands around a tin cup while his truck sat without a needed part. A quartermaster opened a crate and found less than what had been promised. The shortage had a texture. North Africa needed transport, fuel, and vehicles across long distances of its own. The Atlantic War demanded ships, submarines, aircraft, trained crews, and industrial effort. The West could not be ignored because Britain remained in the war, and Allied pressure did not disappear while Germany fought in the East. The Third Reich had opened more problems than it could solve cleanly. I find it unsettling to picture that map of Europe, because the arrows and fronts make Germany look powerful at first glance, while the real story is hidden in thinning fuel stocks, worn engines, and units that keep asking for men who are no longer there. Maps can show reach better than strain. They can make a front look like control. They do not show the shaking hands of a clerk copying another casualty number into a ledger. The Eastern Front also took time, and time was another resource Germany was losing. Every month, the Soviet Union remained in the war, allowed Soviet production to recover, Allied strength to grow, and German losses to deepen. A quick campaign could have hidden many weaknesses. A long war made them public to everyone inside the system, from commanders to drivers to infantrymen waiting in the snow. In a headquarters room, a cold cup of coffee sat beside a map marked with several theatres at once. The Eastern Line ran longest and darkest, pulling the eye back no matter where one tried to look. A hand moved from the Soviet front to the Atlantic, then down toward North Africa, then back east again. There was never enough to satisfy every demand. The war had become a balance that Germany could not hold easily. The strange cruelty of Barbarossa was that its early promise had been expansion, but its lasting effect was confinement. It locked Germany into a vast land war, while other fronts continued to require attention. The invasion had been meant to make the Reich safer and richer. Instead, it forced the Reich to spread itself across too many fires at once. Barbarossa not only trapped Germany in the east, but forced the Third Reich to spend men, fuel, steel, and attention across fronts that all demanded more than Berlin could comfortably give. As the pressure spread from the Soviet front into the rest of the war, the cost did not arrive as one clean disaster, but as a slow wearing away through seasons, campaigns, and lists of names. In the next stage, that exhaustion would appear most clearly in thinning companies, empty bunks, letters that could not be delivered, and casualty books filling faster than replacements could arrive. Inside a German shelter on the Eastern Front, the empty bunks were easier to notice than the men still sleeping. A few weeks earlier, the unit had been louder, fuller, and more familiar, with voices that could be recognized in the dark. Now there were new faces near the stove, new boots drying badly near the wall, and old helmets resting where their owners no longer returned. A casualty book lay open on a crate. Some names had been crossed out. The clerk who kept the list moved his pencil slowly, not because the task was difficult, but because repetition had made it heavy. One name was marked wounded, another missing, another dead, and another, transferred after frostbite, took several toes. Beside the book lay letters that had not been sent because nobody knew where to send them anymore. The paper stayed clean while the number of men became fewer. The Eastern Front consumed German manpower at a scale that could not be hidden inside reports forever. Battles, disease, frostbite, exhaustion, accidents, artillery, Soviet counterattacks and ordinary exposure wore down units month after month. Germany could still send replacements, but replacements did not restore everything that had been lost. A new man could fill a space on a roster without carrying the memory of the men who had stood there before him. It is a sad kind of arithmetic when an army can replace a number, but not the hands, habits, nerves, and experience that made the old unit work. The missing men had known which officer spoke too softly under shell fire, which machine gun jammed in cold weather, which road flooded after rain, and which soldier could be trusted on night watch. Their knowledge disappeared quietly. It left behind silence in the wrong places. A young replacement might sit on a bunk with his pack still unopened, watching older soldiers without knowing where to place his hands. His uniform looked newer, his cheeks less hollow, and his eyes moved too quickly around the shelter. Nobody hated him for being new. They simply knew he had arrived in a war that had already taken time to understand. The older men looked at him and saw both help and danger. He might learn fast, or he might freeze when the first shells came in. He might step where no one should step, speak too loudly near a forward position, or fail to notice the sound that meant Soviet patrols were close. Experience at the Eastern Front was not a decoration. It was a way of staying alive. A person today might imagine a unit as a fixed block on a map, but on the ground it was a room of tired bodies, sore feet, dirty bandages, private memories, and empty places that changed how every order felt. A company could still exist in German reports while feeling hollow to the men inside it. Its number remained. Its strength did not. The losses also reached backward in families. A letter might sit unfinished in a pocket after a soldier was killed, the words inside still speaking as if tomorrow were certain. Another man might receive mail from home addressed to a friend who had died 2 days earlier, and hold the envelope before giving it to the clerk. The front not only took bodies, it interrupted conversations that would never be completed. In the shelter, a soldier lifted a helmet from a chair and set it on a shelf because he needed somewhere to sit. He did it carefully, as if moving the helmet too casually would admit too much. Nearby, another man rubbed his thumb across a photograph until the edge softened. The stove gave little heat, and nobody wasted it by standing far away. The war had become a slow thinning. German commanders still needed units to hold lines, prepare attacks, guard roads, and respond to Soviet pressure. The orders continued to arrive as if the human material behind them could keep stretching. But men were not fuel cans or rifle cartridges. They could not be delivered in exact shape, exact quality, and exact time. The army was learning the difference between filling a gap and restoring strength. I find it unsettling to picture those empty bunks because they show the cost of Barbarossa more clearly than a bold arrow on any map. Each space meant a body gone from the line, a habit lost, a voice missing at night, and a family somewhere waiting for news. The Eastern Front turned strategy into absences. The room itself became a casualty list. As older soldiers vanished, the unit's confidence changed. Men spoke less about quick victory and more about boots, food, ammunition, and whether the next replacement knew how to keep low under fire. Their faces sharpened, their shoulders bent, and their humour grew shorter. A soldier who had survived since the summer carried more than his rifle. He carried the weight of knowing how many had not. The casualty book closed at last, but the problem stayed open. Outside, the cold front waited, and somewhere beyond the snow, Soviet guns remained active. Inside, the bunks showed what months in the east had done. Germany could occupy ground, but each kilometre had taken men it could not truly recreate. The growing casualty lists showed that the Eastern Front was not only consuming land, fuel, and machines, but also the trained men who made German units dangerous. As experienced soldiers disappeared and replacements arrived in rooms already marked by empty bunks, later victories would carry less meaning than they once had. Ahead, Germany would still launch attacks and seize ground, but behind each success would sit thinner depots, tired crews, and soldiers sleeping spot machines that could no longer hide the original mistake. German forces did not become harmless after Barbarossa failed before Moscow. They still attacked, still broke through lines, still captured ground, and still forced Soviet units into terrible danger. On German maps, new arrows appeared again, pointing toward rivers, cities, oil fields, rail centres, and defensive positions that seemed worth one more push. A tired officer could still look at the paper and believe movement had returned. The army was still dangerous. That is what makes the failure of Barbarossa more complicated. It was not a simple story where Germany attacked the Soviet Union, failed once, and immediately collapsed. The Wehrmacht remained capable of major operations after 1941, and in German reports, many later advances could still sound impressive. Cities fell, territory changed hands, and Soviet losses continued to be severe. But the meaning of victory had changed. In the first summer, German leaders believed each success might help produce a final Soviet collapse. After Moscow, another captured town did not carry the same promise. Another road taken did not end the war. Another Soviet force damaged did not make the Soviet Union disappear. It is a cold irony when an army can keep winning battles while the war itself keeps moving farther away from victory. The German army could still push forward in places, but each push demanded fuel, shells, spare parts, trained men, and time. Those things were no longer easily hidden behind confidence. The Eastern Front had become too large for single victories to repair. A soldier in a later offensive might still feel the old rhythm at first. Trucks started, guns fired, infantry moved, and officers gave orders with the familiar urgency of attack. Dust or snow rose under boots, depending on the season, and men moved past damaged vehicles with rifles held close. For a few hours or days, it could feel like the campaign had recovered its old shape. Then the older problems returned. A fuel truck arrived late. A company took losses it could not replace properly. A captured road needed guarding. A damaged tank waited for starts that had to come from too far away. The front advanced, but the rear thinned behind it. A person today might look at a later German advance and think momentum had been restored, but on the ground that momentum rested on tired drivers, patched engines, shrinking reserves, and soldiers sleeping beside vehicles that should have been in repair yards. The army still had teeth, but the jaw was under strain. The deeper the war went, the more each success carried wear inside it. Victory became expensive in ways that could not be paid for forever. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had survived the first blow and continued adapting. Its armies suffered badly, but they kept forming again. Its industry had been moved, damaged, rebuilt, and forced into production under brutal pressure. The state that German planners expected to collapse quickly had turned into an opponent that could absorb losses and return with more weight over time. This did not make Soviet suffering any smaller. The cost was enormous, and many of the people carrying that endurance paid with hunger, cold, forced labour, battlefield death, and fear. But from the German side, the strategic result was clear enough. The Soviet Union had not broken when it needed to break. A German officer could stand beside a map after another advance and still see the same large problem. The front line had moved, but the war had not become shorter. The railways still needed work. The roads still punished transport. The distances still swallowed time, and Soviet resistance still gathered beyond the next line. The arrow had moved forward into a larger burden. The supply depots showed it more honestly than speeches. Fuel drums sat fewer than requested. Ammunition crates were counted carefully. Repair crews stripped usable parts from machines that could not be saved. A soldier waiting near a truck might rest his head against the wooden sideboard and fall asleep before anyone told him to move. I find it startling to picture these later victories because they could look like proof of strength, while quietly proving how much strength had already been spent. A captured city might appear in a report as a success. On the road behind it were wounded men, broken axles, empty cans, and units already being asked to prepare for another demand. The army kept moving, but the cost travelled with it. This is why Barbarossa remained the central wound. It did not destroy the Third Reich in one clean moment. It did not end German offensive power immediately. Instead, it forced Germany into a war where even victories could no longer undo the original failure to destroy the Soviet Union quickly. The later campaigns carried the shadow of that failure. Every plan had to deal with a Soviet state still alive, a front still enormous, and a German system already stretched across too many needs. Success became local. The larger problem remained. A soldier might see a new town taken and still wonder how long they would hold it. He might hear officers speak of the next objective while looking at the same worn boots, the same thin rations, and the same tired faces around him. The word victory had not disappeared. It had become heavier. The later German victories in the East were real, but they no longer had the power to erase the failed gamble of Barbarossa. As the war dragged on, each success sat on top of longer fronts, thinner reserves, worn machines, and men who could not be replaced as easily as reports suggested. The invasion had not killed the Third Reich in one stroke, but it had opened a wound that kept bleeding through fuel depots, casualty lists, frozen roads, and every new order to attack again. Barbarossa did not end the Third Reich in one sudden cut. It opened a wound that kept bleeding through roads, depots, casualty books, frozen fields, and broken machines long after the first summer had passed us. A supply column stretched across a road that seemed to have no end, its trucks carrying too little fuel for too many demands. Somewhere farther east, men still waited for what had already been used up behind them. The wound stayed open. From 1941 onward, the invasion of the Soviet Union enforced Germany into a war of exhaustion on a scale it had not prepared to carry. The campaign that had been meant to destroy Soviet power quickly became the front that consumed German strength slowly. Men, fuel, horses, trucks, shells, winter clothing, trained officers, mechanics, and patients all flowed east in enormous quantities. Much of it never came back. A German clerk could see the wound in numbers. He turned pages in a ledger, added another list of missing men, and pressed his pencil harder when the lead began to break. A mechanic saw it in vehicles lined beside a road, some stripped for parts, some frozen silent, some burned down to shapes that no longer looked useful. A soldier saw it in the face of the man next to him, thinner than he had been in June. It is a bitter thing when a war meant to make an empire stronger becomes the place where that empire sees itself piece by piece. Hitler had opened Barbarossa to destroy the Soviet Union and seize strategic freedom. Instead, he opened a front so large that even German victories could not close it. The farther the army advanced, the more it had to feed, guard, repair, and replace. The Eastern Front did not need to kill Germany all at once. It only had to keep demanding more than Germany could comfortably provide. Every winter coat that arrived late, every fuel drum emptied too soon, every bridge needing guards, and every replacement sent into a unit that had lost its experienced core became part of the same slow damage. The Reich was not bleeding from one place. It was bleeding from many small openings at once. In German reports, the war could still be described with controlled words. Positions were held, attacks were prepared, and supplies were requested. On the ground, those words became boots split at the seam, bandages stiff with old blood, a rifle cleaned by hands that no longer felt warm, and a truck driver sleeping with his forehead against the steering wheel. The report was tidy. The road was not. A person today might imagine collapse as a single dramatic fall, but Barbarossa worked more like hunger, frost, rust, and fatigue, gathering quietly until strength no longer returned after rest. The campaign took from the German army in ways that were not always visible from far away. It reduced the quality of units, stretched officers, exhausted crews, and forced commanders to choose between fronts that all needed more. It made every later decision heavier. The Soviet Union had suffered terribly, but it had survived the first blow. Its factories moved east, its armies rebuilt, and its people endured under a level of violence and loss that German planners had not anticipated. The longer the war continued, the more the original German assumption looked like a failure of imagination as well as a failure of logistics. The enemy had not broken on schedule. That delay changed everything. A short war could have hidden many weaknesses. A long war showed them in fuel depots, railway problems, replacement shortages, and worn vehicles. It showed them in units that still had names but no longer had the same strength. It showed them in soldiers who stopped talking about victory and started counting socks, cartridges, and the number of men still able to walk. A German soldier might stand near a burned tank with snow on his shoulders and watch smoke rise from another village ahead. He might remember the first days of the invasion, when roads seemed to open and prisoners filled the rear. Now every road seemed to ask for payment. Every field could hide resistance, every town could demand another fight, and every mile carried a cost that did not end when the shooting stopped. I find it unsettling to picture Barbarossa this way, not as one failed offensive, but as a decision that kept reaching forward and taking more lives long after the original confidence had gone cold. The wound did not look the same in every season. In summer, it looked like dust and distance. In autumn, it looked like mud and stalled trucks. In winter, it looked like frost-bitten hands and frozen engines. By the time the war dragged on, the Eastern Front had become more than a battlefield. It was a drain on the whole Third Reich. The invasion meant Germany had to fight a vast land war while still facing pressure elsewhere. It had opened a problem that could not be solved by another arrow on a map or another speech about will. This is why Barbarossa doomed the Reich in a deeper sense. It did not make the German defeat instant, and it did not prevent later German attacks, but it turned the war into something Germany could not finish quickly, could not feed easily, and could not leave without admitting disaster. The invasion became a trap built from ambition, contempt, distance, and time. A map of the Eastern Front after 1941 did not show a clean road to victory. It showed length, strain, exposed flanks, supply lines, and a demand that kept returning. Beside that map stood human evidence: empty bunks, damaged hands, unopened letters, stripped engines, tired horses, and men waiting for orders they no longer trusted. The wound was still open. Barbarossa did not destroy the Third Reich in one clean moment, but it turned the Eastern Front into a wound that drained German men, machines, fuel and belief month after month. To understand why that wound was so deep, the story must move past trucks, mud, and maps into the ideas that made Germany misread the people it invaded. Beneath the failed logistics was something even darker. Nazi ideology had taught German leaders to see millions of Soviet people as weak, disposable, and easy to conquer. On a German table, a propaganda sheet could make the Eastern enemy look simple. The words were hard, cold, and certain, reducing millions of people into categories that seemed easy to despise and easy to rule. In those papers, the Soviet Union was not treated as a living country full of workers, soldiers, families, cities, farms, fear and endurance. It was treated as something waiting to be broken. The paper was lying. Nazi ideology shaped Barbarossa from the beginning. This was not only a military invasion meant to defeat an army or seize territory. It was also a racial and ideological war, driven by hatred of Jews, contempt for Slavic peoples, anti-communism, and a brutal vision of conquest in the East. That hatred did not make German planning sharper. It made it blind. A German officer could read reports that described the Soviet enemy as weak, backward, disorganized, and ready to collapse under pressure. He could hear speeches that turned real human beings into obstacles or resources. He could look at a map and imagine that terror would make the population obey, that Soviet soldiers would lose the will to fight, and that the state would come apart once the first blows landed. The ideology gave arrogance the sound of analysis. It is a dangerous thing when a regime mistakes its own contempt for knowledge. The Nazis did not only underestimate Soviet weapons or roads, they underestimated people. They underestimated what fear, anger, homeland, family, survival, and state pressure could make human beings endure. The reality on the ground kept refusing the fantasy. Soviet soldiers were surrounded in huge numbers, but other units formed again farther east. Civilians suffered under occupation, but that suffering often made hatred of the invader deeper rather than weaker. Workers lost homes, factories, and relatives, but machines were still moved, production restarted, and cities kept feeding the war effort. The people Germany had been taught to dismiss did not behave like the propaganda said they should. A German soldier at the front might not think in those large terms. He might simply crouch in the snow, watching a Soviet position that should not have been there, according to what he had once believed. His fingers would ache around the rifle, his scarf would freeze near his mouth, and his boots would stiffen in the cold. Across the field, the enemy was still firing. That was the argument. Nazi brutality made the mistake worse. Occupation policies brought hunger, forced labour, mass violence, murder and terror into Soviet villages, towns, prisoner camps, and Jewish communities. The invasion carried a promise of domination, not ordinary military defeat. For many people under German rule, surrender did not guarantee safety. That knowledge changed the emotional shape of the war. A person today might imagine fear as something that always makes people obey. But fear can also teach them that there is nothing safe left to lose. A family whose food had been taken, whose neighbour had disappeared, or whose village had been punished, did not need a political lecture to understand the danger. A soldier defending a city could think of the road behind him and know that defeat might carry the war into his own home. The invasion made survival personal. The German army did not create Soviet endurance by itself, but Nazi ideology helped sharpen the reason to resist. The more the occupation revealed its cruelty, the harder it became to imagine German rule as anything other than a disaster. Partisans had more reasons to hide in forests. Civilians had more reasons to pass information, conceal supplies, or simply refuse to trust German orders. Red Army soldiers had more reasons to keep fighting even after terrible losses. The propaganda sheet on the table could not show that. It could not show a woman in a factory with oil on her sleeves, tightening bolts on a machine that had been moved east. It could not show a Soviet soldier wrapping cloth around his feet before returning to a frozen line. It could not show a child standing in an empty kitchen after soldiers had searched the house. Contempt had erased the details that mattered most. I find it unsettling to picture Nazi leaders studying the East through hatred, because they were not only planning a campaign, they were teaching themselves not to see the human strength that would make the campaign fail. They saw inferiority where there was endurance. They saw disorder where there was the capacity to rebuild. They saw a population to be ruled, but not a society that could help sustain a war. This blindness had military consequences. If an enemy is expected to collapse quickly, then planners can excuse weak preparation for a long war. They can assume shortages will not matter. Winter will arrive after victory, and occupied populations can be controlled through violence. They can draw an invasion that depends on the enemy behaving exactly as their prejudice predicts. Barbarossa carried that error into the field. The Soviet Union was not saved by virtue alone, and its own system was harsh, coercive, and often ruthless towards its own people. But that does not change the central failure of Nazi thinking. German leaders invaded with a worldview that made them underestimate the endurance, depth, and mobilized power of the country they meant to destroy. They not only misjudged the army, they misjudged the people. By the time the war dragged past Moscow, the lie had become costly. The supposedly weak enemy was still fighting. The supposedly broken state was still producing. The supposedly conquered rear was still restless. Each of these facts stood against the ideology that had helped start the invasion. A soldier did not need to read theory to feel it. He could see Soviet resistance return after encirclements. He could see civilians watching from shut doors with hatred held behind their eyes. He could see new Soviet guns appear after old ones had been captured. The world refused to match the papers on the German table. Nazi ideology did not help Germany understand the Soviet Union, but made it blind to the endurance of the people, workers, soldiers, and civilians it meant to conquer. From that blindness came a campaign that underestimated distance, resistance, industry, suffering, and the rage created by occupation itself. This is why Barbarossa became more than a failed invasion, because it turned Hitler's war into something too vast, too brutal, and too consuming for the Third Reich to control. The Eastern Front had become too large for the men who had opened it. It stretched across thousands of kilometers of fields, forests, rivers, rail lines, ruined villages, frozen roads, and positions that never seemed to stay quiet for long. Trucks still needed fuel, soldiers needed coats, horses still needed shells, wounded men still needed a way back through roads, already damaged by weather and war. Moscow had not fallen. That fact sat heavily over everything. Barbarossa had failed in its decisive purpose. It had not destroyed the Soviet Union quickly, had not broken the Soviet state, and had not given Hitler the clean Eastern victory his regime had promised itself. German forces had won battles, taken prisoners, and advanced deep into Soviet territory, but the larger result was a front that refused to close. The invasion had created a war too wide to be held easily and too costly to leave. A map of the front could show the problem, but only partly. It could show the long line, the bulges, the railways, the rivers, and the cities still contested or threatened. It could show arrows, supply routes, and positions marked in careful ink. It could not show a driver sitting behind a frozen wheel, rubbing his hands together because the fuel he carried was still not enough. It is a terrible kind of ambition when a war leader starts to become larger than the country meant to control. Germany was now fighting geography, Soviet industry, Soviet manpower, partisan resistance, bad roads, weather, fuel shortages, and the moral consequences of its own occupation. None of these pressures worked alone. They pressed together until every German success became harder to turn into anything final. The Soviet Union had taken blows that would have destroyed many states. Armies had been encircled, cities threatened, civilians terrorized, and huge territories lost. Yet factories had moved east, workers had rebuilt production, soldiers had formed new lines, and the state had continued forcing itself into the war. The country Germany expected to collapse had instead become harder to finish with every month it survived. German soldiers felt that truth in ordinary discomfort. A man in a trench could run his thumb over a cracked rifle stock and hear guns farther down the line. A mechanic could strip parts from one disabled truck to keep another moving for a few more days. A clerk could copy losses into a book and leave blank spaces beside names whose bodies had not been found. The war was not ending around them. It was multiplying. A person today might imagine defeat beginning with one dramatic collapse, but here it began as 1,000 small failures to supply, replace, repair. Warm, feed, guard, and understand what Germany had unleashed. The East did not simply take German soldiers in battle. It took time from other fronts, fuel from other plans, machines from other needs, and confidence from men who had once believed the campaign would be short. The price spread through the entire Reich. The occupation made the problem even worse. Nazi brutality had not made the rear calm or cooperative. It had produced hatred, fear, resistance, and a war in which many civilians saw German rule as a threat to survival itself. Villages did not become safe because they appeared behind the front in German reports. Forests, railways, bridges still needed guards. The invasion was supposed to make Germany stronger by seizing resources and eliminating a major enemy. Instead, it locked Germany into the largest land war it could have chosen. The longer the war lasted, the more the original plan looked like a trap built by arrogance. Every month after 1941 made the Soviet Union harder to break and Germany harder to restore. A German officer could still stand over a table and demand another operation. He could point toward a river, a city, or a rail junction and describe the need for movement. But beside the map were reports of fuel shortages, replacement gaps, equipment losses, partisan attacks, weather damage, and units needing rest they would not receive. The paper stayed flat. The war did not. I find it unsettling to picture those maps layered with arrows and positions, because beneath every clean line were cold hands, empty cans, burned trucks, closed village doors, and men who had stopped believing that one more push would solve the larger problem. The Third Reich had not lost all strength at once. It still fought, attacked, and killed on a massive scale, but Barbarossa had changed the shape of the war in a way Germany could not undo. The invasion forced Germany to keep spending itself in the east while the rest of the war remained alive around it. The West did not disappear, the Atlantic did not disappear, North Africa did not disappear, and Allied pressure would continue to grow. The Eastern Front absorbed men and machines that could not be everywhere at once. Every front became weaker because the East kept asking for more. By this stage, Barbarossa was no longer just a failed campaign. It had become the central mechanism of German exhaustion. The plan had depended on a quick Soviet collapse, and when that collapse did not happen, the campaign turned into a struggle against depth, industry, weather, distance, resistance, and time. Germany could still win battles inside that struggle. It could not easily escape the struggle itself. The road from the 22nd of June 1941 had not led to the victory. Hitler imagined it had led into mud, snow, empty depots, casualty books, partisan roads, evacuated factories, and Soviet armies that kept returning after terrible losses. What looked like an opening of conquest had become a door into a war without the short ending Germany needed. The invasion had become too large for its maker. Barbarossa doomed the Third Reich because it turned Hitler's war into a struggle against space, industry, people, weather, resistance, and the consequences of Nazi violence all at once. The final part returns to the first morning of the invasion and looks back at the arrows, maps, and confidence that made the disaster possible. On that old Barbarossa map, the lines toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine no longer look like routes to victory, but like paths leading into mud, snow, hunger, mass death, and a Reich slowly condemning itself. An old map of Operation Barbarossa looks different after the whole story has been told. The arrows that once ran toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine no longer look clean or confident. They look like roads leading into mud, snow, hunger, burned villages, empty fuel cans, frozen rifles, and long casualty lists. The paper still lies flat on the table, but the war it opened was never flat. It was a door into ruin. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany crossed into the Soviet Union, believing that speed, shock, and violence could force a decision before the cost became too heavy. The plan depended on the Soviet state breaking quickly, the Red Army collapsing under huge encirclements, and German supply lines somehow keeping up with a front that stretched across enormous distances. For a short time, early victories made that belief look strong. German reports counted prisoners, towns, vehicles, and ground taken. But the ground kept widening. The first lesson of Barbarossa is that a country is not conquered because a map says it can be. Roads had to carry fuel, bread, ammunition, spare parts, wounded men, and Winterlichern across distances that grew worse with every advance. Railways had to be repaired or converted. Bridges had to be guarded. Trucks wore out, horses died, and soldiers learned that a tank without fuel was only heavy metal beside the road. It is a dangerous kind of arrogance when leaders believe hatred can shorten distance and confidence can replace logistics. Hitler wanted a decisive war in the East, but he opened a campaign that demanded more than Germany could keep providing. The Soviet Union was wounded terribly, yet it did not vanish. Its armies were battered, But more lines appeared. Its factories were threatened, but machines and workers were dragged east. The second lesson is that early success can make a bad plan harder to question. The German army won huge battles in 1941, surrounded Soviet forces, and drew deep into Soviet territory. Those victories were real, and they should not be dismissed as if the invasion failed from the first hour. But their meaning changed when they failed to produce the collapse Berlin had expected. A soldier in those months could see both victory and danger without knowing how to join them together. He could watch prisoners march west in long, dusty columns, then hear rifle fire again. Days later, from a forest or village ahead, he could see an officer mark another advance on a map, then help push a truck from mud until his hands shook. He could hear Moscow was closer, then look at his boots, his canteen, and the empty road behind him. The body knew what the map ignored. The third lesson is that war of conquest creates enemies faster than it creates safety. Nazi occupation brought hunger, terror, mass violence, forced labour, and murder into Soviet villages, prisoner camps, Jewish communities, and occupied towns. This was not a clean military mistake. Barbarossa was tied to Nazi ideology, racial hatred, and a brutal plan to dominate the East. A person today might look for the failure in winter weather or one lost battle, but the deeper failure was already present in the way Nazi Germany saw the people it intended to conquer. Contempt did not make the enemy easier to understand. It made the Germans blind to Soviet endurance, Soviet mobilization, partisan resistance, and the fury created by occupation itself. A regime that treated millions as disposable also misunderstood what millions might endure when survival was at stake. By the time winter came before Moscow, the weaknesses had gathered in one place. The army was tired, the vehicles were worn, the roads were damaged, the supplies were stretched, and Soviet resistance had not broken. The cold did not defeat Germany by itself. It showed the damage that distance, false assumptions, bad preparation, and Soviet survival had already done. Then the Red Army struck back before Moscow. German soldiers who had expected to endure winter near the prize were forced into retreat through snow, confusion, abandoned vehicles, and frozen roads. That moment did not end the war, but it broke the belief that Barbarossa could still achieve a quick victory. After that, the Eastern Front became a war of exhaustion. Germany could still win battles. It could still launch attacks, seize ground, and remain deadly. But every later success sat on top of the same wound. More fuel went east, more men disappeared into casualty lists, more machines broke down, more fronts demanded attention, and the war became too large for the Third Reich to control. I find it unsettling that Barbarossa did not doom the Third Reich by failing all at once, but by continuing to demand payment long after the first confidence had disappeared. It bled Germany through supply lines, winter roads, replacement shortages, partisan attacks, evacuated Soviet industry, and a front that would not close. It turned German ambition into a burden that grew heavier with every season. It made the Reich spend itself in the very place Hitler had expected to secure its future. The final lesson is not that Germany lost because of blood alone, or winter alone, or Moscow alone. Those are only pieces of the larger truth. Barbarossa doomed the Third Reich, but turned an invasion meant to be fast into a war that Germany could not win quickly, could not supply comfortably, and could not escape without admitting the failure of its whole Eastern vision. It forced Germany to fight geography, industry, population, weather, resistance, time, and the consequences of Nazi violence all at once. On the old map, the arrows still point east. They still run toward cities that once looked like objectives. but now each line carries what followed it. The fuel cans, the empty bunks, the frozen hands, the burned trucks, the factories moving away, the villages searched, the soldiers returning from another failed push with mud dried on their coats. The map has become less a plan than a record of self-destruction. Operation Barbarossa began as Hitler's promise of domination in the East. It became the front where the Third Reich began to condemn itself, not because defeat arrived immediately, but because the invasion created a war too vast, too brutal, and too hungry for Germany to master. And that is where this story rests tonight. Barbarossa was not a single failed march into winter, but a vast chain of arrogance, violence, distance, resistance, and exhaustion that slowly turned Nazi Germany's eastern ambition against itself. The invasion that Hitler imagined as a doorway to victory became a road through mud, snow, empty depots, broken bodies, and crimes that made the war harder and darker with every month. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Rest your eyes now, let the battlefield fade into silence, and good night.